What if humanity has been studying the wrong version of history all along? Across forgotten deserts and submerged cities, archaeologists are uncovering artifacts that should not exist. Each discovery challenges physics, time, and logic itself, suggesting something beyond comprehension is buried beneath our world, waiting to be fully revealed now. Deep within the eastern slopes of the Ecuadorian Andes lies a vast limestone labyrinth known as Cueva de los Tallos. The entrance opens into a shadowed sinkhole where dense jungle gives way to cold stone air, and the sound of dripping water echoes into darkness that seems to swallow distance itself. For centuries, local indigenous communities, particularly the Shuar people, have known of this cave system, not as a mystery, but as part of a lived landscape, woven into oral tradition and cultural memory. The cave descends through narrow passages, opening into large subterranean chambers carved by water over immense spans of time. Stalactites hang like frozen roots. Underground rivers cut silent paths through limestone corridors. In the 20th century, this natural formation drew the attention of speleologists and explorers who documented its scale and complexity, confirming it as one of the most extensive cave systems in the region. Yet beyond its geological significance, Cueva de los Tallos became the center of a much more unusual narrative. In the 1970s, accounts emerged from explorer Eric von Däniken and others suggesting the existence of a hidden metallic library deep within the cave. According to these claims, vast chambers contained sheets or tablets of metal inscribed with intricate symbols, records of knowledge that did not align with known indigenous writing systems or any recognized archaeological record of the region. The descriptions varied between accounts. Some spoke of orderly stacks of metallic pages, others of a subterranean archive arranged with deliberate precision. Mainstream archaeology, however, has not confirmed these findings. Official expeditions, including those involving military personnel and scientific researchers, mapped sections of the cave and documented its geology, fauna, and passageways, but did not report any metallic structures or artifacts matching those descriptions. In this sense, the metal library remains unverified, existing primarily in secondary narratives, expedition retellings, and speculative literature rather than in catalogued archaeological evidence. Still, the cave itself resists simple dismissal. Its vastness is undeniable. Its remote chambers, many difficult to access without specialized equipment, have not been exhaustively surveyed. Even today, portions of the system remain challenging to map in full detail due to flooding, collapses, and the sheer complexity of interconnected tunnels. In such environments, absence of evidence can feel less like closure and more like incompleteness. This gap between documented exploration and claimed discovery is where the mystery persists. How do such narratives arise around specific locations? Are they born from misinterpretations of natural formations seen in low light and uncertain conditions? Or do they reflect something else entirely? Lost expeditions, exaggerated retellings, or cultural intersections where myth and observation overlap? The Shuar, who have long maintained a relationship with the cave, describe it in terms that are spiritual and ecological rather than archival. In their cosmology, caves can be thresholds, places where the visible and invisible worlds approach one another. These interpretations exist independently of modern claims, yet they inevitably become entangled when outsiders attempt to translate oral tradition into documentary speculation. Over time, Cueva de los Tallos has become a meeting point of disciplines and imaginations: geology, archaeology, anthropology, and fringe exploration. Each brings its own language, its own expectations of what should be found underground, and yet the cave itself offers no confirmation, only stone, water, and passageways leading further into darkness. Even now, questions remain suspended in the humid air of its chambers. What lies in the sections still insufficiently explored? How much of what is said about the cave belongs to observation, and how much belongs to interpretation shaped by time, storytelling, and the human tendency to fill silence with structure? And perhaps the most enduring uncertainty is this: when multiple narratives converge on a place like Cueva de los Tallos, where does the line truly fall between what is hidden, what is forgotten, and what has never been found at all? The passage from the depths of Cueva de los Tallos leaves behind a lingering sense of enclosure, stone corridors, dripping silence, and the feeling that history itself can narrow into tunnels we are still trying to fully map. Yet as exploration shifts from underground caverns to high-altitude basins, the nature of mystery changes. It no longer hides in darkness, but in plain sight, resting on museum shelves and archaeological tables where interpretation becomes just as complex as excavation. Far south, across the Andean spine, near the waters of Lake Titicaca, another artifact draws quiet attention. It is not buried now, but preserved. A ceramic bowl, modest in size, weathered by time, yet marked with something that resists easy categorization. This is the object known as the Fuente Magna bowl. At first glance, it appears consistent with pre-Columbian ceramic traditions of the Andean highlands. Its shape, its craftsmanship, and its material composition align broadly with vessels associated with early cultures of the region. The bowl itself was reportedly discovered near the village of Chua, not far from the archaeological complex of Tiwanaku, a site already deeply significant in Andean archaeology for its monumental stone architecture and its role in pre-Inca civilization. But what draws sustained attention is not the form of the bowl, it is the interior surface. Etched into the clay are inscriptions that some researchers have described as resembling cuneiform-like characters. The markings appear deliberate, arranged in linear sequences that curve along the interior basin. To the untrained eye, they may seem like decorative patterns or symbolic motifs common in ancient ceramics. Yet to others, they evoke writing systems that are geographically and historically distant from the Andes. This is where the Fuente Magna bowl begins to move from artifact into question. Mainstream archaeological interpretations generally approach the object with caution. Some scholars suggest the inscriptions may be a later addition, possibly incised after firing, or even the result of modern interference. Others argue that the markings could be an imitation of writing systems seen elsewhere, introduced through cultural contact in more recent centuries rather than antiquity. In this view, the bowl remains significant, but not as evidence of transoceanic contact in the ancient world. However, alternative interpretations have circulated for decades. Some researchers and independent investigators have pointed to the resemblance between the bowl's inscriptions and Mesopotamian scripts, particularly early Sumerian forms of writing. This comparison has led to speculative theories suggesting possible long-distance cultural exchange, diffusion of symbolic systems, or even lost episodes of contact between distant civilizations. These ideas remain outside academic consensus, yet they persist in discussions precisely because the object itself sits at the intersection of ambiguity and possibility. It is real, tangible, and preserved, but its meaning is not universally agreed upon. What makes the Fuente Magna bowl particularly intriguing is not only the inscriptions, but the context of its discovery. The high-altitude basin around Lake Titicaca has long been considered one of the cradles of complex Andean civilization. The monumental ruins of Tiwanaku reflect advanced engineering, astronomical alignment, and a cultural depth that continues to be studied and debated. In such a landscape, even small artifacts can take on amplified significance, as each object contributes to a broader attempt to reconstruct fragmented histories. Yet the bowl resists simple placement within any single narrative. If the inscriptions are symbolic, what do they represent? If they are linguistic, who might have inscribed them, and when? And if they are unrelated to known writing systems of the Andes, How did such forms appear on a ceramic vessel in this region? Some interpretations suggest the possibility of convergent symbolism, where human societies, separated by geography and time, independently develop similar visual systems to represent ideas. Others entertain the idea of cultural transmission routes that are not yet fully documented in the archaeological record. And still others view the markings as an anomaly, an isolated case that does not necessarily indicate broader historical patterns. What remains consistent across all perspectives is uncertainty. Unlike monumental ruins or stratified settlements, a single object offers limited context. It does not speak in layers of occupation or long sequences of development. It exists as a moment preserved but partially detached from its original surroundings. And in archaeology, context is often as important as the artifact itself. Standing at this intersection of interpretation, the Fuente Magna bowl becomes less about definitive answers and more about the limits of what can be confidently known. It invites careful examination without demanding immediate resolution. It encourages comparison without guaranteeing equivalence. And so the questions remain suspended, much like those echoing through distant cave systems and buried chambers. How many narratives can a single object carry before its original story becomes indistinguishable from the stories built around it? And in the quiet space between certainty and speculation, what other artifacts still wait, misunderstood, misread, or simply not yet fully explained? From the high-altitude silence of the Bolivian Andes, the narrative does not so much shift as it thins, like air becoming harder to breathe as elevation increases. After examining the enigmatic markings of the Fuente Magna bowl near the shores of Lake Titicaca, attention turns once again to a different form of record-keeping, one that does not rely on clay or stone alone, but on fiber, knot, and suspended geometry. In the arid winds of the Andean Plateau, among remnants of ancient settlements and agricultural terraces, lies a quieter kind of artifact. Not carved, not inscribed in ink or fired into ceramic, but tied. This is the world of the quipu, the knotted cord systems of the Andean civilizations, most closely associated with the administrative practices of the Inca state. The example often referred to in discussions of unusual or lesser understood finds is the Khipu from Incahuasi, associated with the region of Incahuasi. Like many quipu recovered across the Andes, it consists of a main cord from which numerous pendant cords descend, each marked with knots arranged in deliberate patterns. Some cords are dyed in different colors. Others vary in twist, spacing, and direction. At first glance, the system appears structured, even methodical, and mainstream archaeology has long understood quipu as instruments of record-keeping, used for accounting, census data, resource management, and possibly calendrical or administrative tracking within the Inca Empire. Chroniclers of the early colonial period noted their use, describing officials known as Quipucamayuk, trained specialists responsible for creating and interpreting these knotted records. Yet even within this established understanding, questions remain. The Khipu of Incahuasi, like others found in less accessible or less thoroughly documented contexts, invites closer examination, not because it contradicts known history, but because it expands the boundaries of how information might have been stored and transmitted. Unlike written scripts that encode language visually, Khipu encode meaning through tactile and spatial arrangement. Number, sequence, hierarchy. These can be represented without ink, parchment, or carved surface. But is that all they represent? Some researchers argue that Khipu may have encoded more than numerical data. The complexity of knot arrangement, cord interaction, and color variation has led to ongoing debate about whether certain Khipu could have contained narrative or linguistic information that has yet to be fully deciphered. If true, this would suggest a form of writing system that operates on principles fundamentally different from alphabetic or syllabic scripts. In this context, Incahuasi becomes not just a location, but a point in a much larger interpretive landscape. The site itself, situated within the broader Andean archaeological network, reflects the architectural and cultural sophistication of pre-Columbian societies in the region. Stone structures, agricultural engineering, and ritual spaces all suggest a high degree of organizational knowledge that would have required equally sophisticated systems of record-keeping. And yet, Khipu remain partially opaque. Modern analytical efforts, including digital modeling and fiber analysis, have identified recurring structural patterns in many surviving Khipu. Some appear to follow base 10 numerical systems. Others exhibit clustering and hierarchy that suggest categorization beyond simple counting. But interpretation is still limited by the absence of a fully recovered key system, if such a unified decoding framework ever existed in the first place. This absence has given rise to multiple lines of interpretation. Within academic archaeology, the prevailing view remains cautious. Khipu are primarily accounting tools, with possible extensions into limited symbolic communication. The evidence supports administrative complexity, but not necessarily full linguistic encoding. However, alternative perspectives propose broader possibilities. Some suggest that Khipu may have functioned as multi-layered information systems, combining numerical data with mnemonic or narrative elements accessible only to trained interpreters. Others speculate that certain Khipu traditions may preserve knowledge systems that were disrupted or partially lost during the colonial period, leaving only fragments available for modern reconstruction. In this sense, Incahuasi is not an isolated puzzle, but part of a larger question about continuity and loss. How much of a knowledge system survives when its interpretive community is disrupted? And what remains legible when the cultural framework that once gave meaning to an object no longer exists in its original form? There is also the quieter possibility that Khipu represent an entirely distinct cognitive approach to recording reality, one that does not translate neatly into written language at all. In such a view, meaning is not stored in symbols that represent sounds or words, but in physical relationships between materials. Tension, spacing, direction, and color interacting as a structured whole. Standing before such an artifact, one might ask whether interpretation is limited not by the object itself, but by the methods used to understand it. The Incahuasi Khipu, like others scattered across museum collections and excavation archives, remains suspended between categories. It is clearly functional, yet not fully understood. It is structured, yet not fully decoded. It belongs to history, yet still resists complete historical placement. And so the questions persist, quietly woven into its fibers. What information was once carried in these knots, and how much of it still waits to be understood? If meaning can be tied into cord and preserved across centuries, what other forms of knowledge might have survived in ways we have not yet learned to read? From the high-altitude stillness of the Andes, where the Incahuasi Khipu hang as silent threads of encoded memory, the journey of inquiry moves further east, across continents, across geological time, and into a landscape shaped by wind-carved stone and remote mountain silence. Here, the narrative shifts again, not downward into earth or inward into fiber, but outward into a vast, cold plateau in western China. In the Bayan Mountains of Qinghai Province, where thin air meets jagged rock and rivers trace their origins through frozen terrain, lies a region long associated with isolation and geological extremes. It is here, in accounts that surfaced in the mid-20th century, that one of archaeology's most controversial objects entered modern discourse, the so-called Bayan Ula stone discs. According to reported discoveries, these objects were allegedly found in a series of mountain caves, hidden chambers carved into limestone and granite formations. Inside these caves, stories describe rows of small, disc-shaped stones, each carefully shaped and perforated at the center. The discs, typically described as ranging in size from handheld to slightly larger, were said to bear intricate grooves etched into their surfaces, forming spiral-like patterns that some interpreted as a form of symbolic inscription. Mainstream archaeological documentation of these specific finds is limited, and their provenance remains a subject of ongoing debate. No widely verified excavation record has firmly established their existence within controlled scientific publication. Instead, much of what is known about the Bayan discs originates from secondary reports, interviews, and later retellings that circulated beyond academic channels. Yet the story persists. In the accounts that brought these objects into broader attention, the discs were described as being discovered alongside human remains in cave environments at high altitude. These remains were reportedly characterized by unusually slender proportions and atypical skeletal features. Some early interpretations speculated about isolated populations or unknown cultural groups inhabiting the region in antiquity. However, without comprehensive excavation records or peer-reviewed analysis of the reported finds, such descriptions remain unconfirmed within established archaeology. The discs themselves, as described, present an immediate visual question. Circular, deliberate, and perforated at the center, they resemble objects that could be functional, ritual, or symbolic. Some interpretations suggest they may be natural stone formations modified by human hands. Others propose ceremonial use, possibly linked to burial practices or cultural storytelling traditions that have not been preserved in surviving historical records. But it is the markings that have drawn the most attention. The engraved grooves reportedly spiral outward in patterns that some have compared, loosely and controversially, to symbolic or proto-written systems. These comparisons have fueled speculative theories suggesting that the discs could represent an unknown communication system or encoded narrative tradition. In more fringe interpretations, the markings have been linked to ideas of lost civilizations or contact narratives that fall far outside accepted archaeological frameworks. Mainstream researchers, however, urge caution. Without verified excavation context, stratigraphic data, or reproducible analysis, it is difficult to assign cultural or chronological certainty to such objects. In archaeology, context is not just important, it is essential. An artifact without context becomes an object suspended in interpretation, vulnerable to misreading, reinterpretation, and mythologization. And yet, even within that caution, there is acknowledgement of something more subtle, the human tendency to assign meaning to pattern. When faced with unfamiliar forms, especially those that appear structured or deliberate, the mind searches for familiarity. Writing, symbol, system, narrative. The discs, as described, sit precisely at this threshold between pattern and interpretation. Could they be natural stones altered by time and chance, later reinterpreted through layers of storytelling? Could they be remnants of a localized cultural practice that has not survived in the archaeological record? Or do they reflect something else entirely, an artifact class that has not yet been properly categorized within known typologies of material culture? These questions remain open not because answers are impossible, but because the evidence, as it exists publicly, is incomplete. Still, the story of the Bayan discs continues to circulate, not only in speculative literature but in broader discussions about the limits of archaeological knowledge. They occupy a unique space in modern mystery narratives, not fully substantiated, yet not entirely dismissed in popular imagination. Their persistence speaks less to confirmed discovery and more to the enduring appeal of unresolved artifacts, objects that resist closure simply by existing at the edge of documentation. In scientific practice, absence of verification is not confirmation of mystery. It is simply an indication of insufficient data. But culturally, such gaps often become something else entirely. Spaces where imagination expands to fill what evidence has not yet defined. And so the discs remain, whether as misinterpreted stones, incomplete records of a forgotten practice, or artifacts awaiting more definitive study. Their surfaces, as described, hold spirals that invite interpretation but do not offer explanation. Their origins remain geographically specific in narrative, yet archaeologically uncertain in record. Standing at the intersection of reported discovery and documented uncertainty, one question lingers quietly in the background. When an object appears to carry meaning but its context is missing, is the mystery located within the artifact itself, or within the limits of what has been preserved, verified, and understood? From the remote silence of the Bayan Mountains, where the disputed Bayan stone discs remain suspended between report and verification, the journey of inquiry turns again, this time crossing oceans, descending through dense cloud cover, and arriving at a coastline where stone rises abruptly from the Atlantic edge of South America. In the city of Rio de Janeiro, where rainforest meets urban sprawl and ocean winds carve constantly at granite peaks, one formation stands apart in both geography and interpretation. It is known as Pedra de Gávea, a massive monolithic mountain rising over 800 meters above sea level, its sheer cliffs overlooking the Atlantic coastline. At first glance, Pedra de Gávea is a geological monument shaped by time, wind, and erosion. Composed primarily of granite and gneiss, its structure is consistent with natural uplift processes that formed much of the coastal mountain range in southeastern Brazil. The site is part of the larger Tijuca Massif, a region studied for its complex geological history and long-standing interaction between rainforest ecosystems and exposed rock formations. But on one side of the mountain, facing the ocean, there are markings that have drawn curiosity for decades. High on a vertical rock face, visible only from certain angles and under specific lighting conditions, appear what some describe as carved inscriptions. To some observers, these markings resemble stylized lettering or symbolic engraving. Others interpret them as natural erosion patterns shaped by wind, water runoff, and biological growth over extended periods of time. The scientific consensus leans strongly toward natural formation. Geologists studying Pedra de Gávea generally attribute the markings to differential weathering, where variations in rock hardness create grooves and shadows that can resemble deliberate carving when viewed from a distance. In humid tropical environments, such processes can be especially pronounced, as moisture, salt, and vegetation interact continuously with exposed stone surfaces. And yet, interpretation does not always remain within geological boundaries. Over time, alternative narratives have emerged around Pedra de Gávea, particularly in popular and fringe literature. Some suggest that the markings resemble ancient scripts, drawing comparisons to Phoenician or other Old World writing systems. These interpretations often point to the symmetry and alignment of certain grooves, proposing that they may reflect intentional design rather than random erosion. Within these speculative frameworks, the mountain becomes more than a geological formation. It becomes a possible marker, an inscribed surface carrying messages from an unknown presence or an undocumented historical encounter. Some versions of this idea propose ancient transoceanic contact, suggesting that seafaring civilizations may have reached South America long before established historical timelines indicate. However, these theories remain outside mainstream archaeological acceptance. No verified inscriptions matching known ancient writing systems have been documented through controlled archaeological excavation on Pedra de Gávea. No inscriptions have been conclusively dated, translated, or linked to any recognized epigraphic tradition. Still, the visual ambiguity of the site continues to invite questions. Part of what sustains this mystery is the mountain's scale and inaccessibility. The steep cliffs, dense vegetation, and weather conditions make close examination of certain rock faces difficult. In environments like this, perception can shift dramatically depending on distance, light angle, and atmospheric clarity. What appears structured from afar may dissolve into irregularity up close. What seems random at one angle may briefly align into recognizable form at another. This interplay between perception and geology is central to how Pedra da Gávea has been interpreted over time. Human cognition is pattern-seeking by nature. Faced with ambiguous shapes, especially those embedded in monumental landscapes, the mind often organizes visual noise into familiar structures, letters, symbols, faces, or architectural traces. And yet, the mountain's reputation as a place of mystery persists, not necessarily because of confirmed evidence, but because of its visual ambiguity combined with cultural storytelling. Local legends, historical speculation, and modern reinterpretations have layered meaning onto the site in ways that extend beyond geological description. Some narratives even suggest the presence of a carved face or monumental profile on the rock surface, visible under certain lighting conditions. While widely attributed to natural erosion by geologists, these formations have nonetheless become part of the mountain's interpretive mythology, illustrating how natural landscapes can acquire narrative significance over time. In academic discourse, Pedra da Gávea remains firmly within the category of natural formation with misinterpreted features. The absence of datable inscriptions, archaeological strata, or associated cultural artifacts supports this classification. But academically defined conclusions do not always fully dissolve public fascination. There is something about the scale of the mountain that resists simple closure. It rises abruptly from the edge of one of the world's most recognizable coastlines, exposed to centuries of wind, rain, and human observation. It exists at a boundary, between forest and ocean, between city and wilderness, between geological time and human interpretation. And so the question lingers, not as assertion, but as reflection. When natural formations begin to resemble human language under certain conditions, where does meaning truly originate? From the stone itself, or from the observer searching within it? As the exploration continues beyond this coastal peak, the broader pattern begins to emerge. Across continents, across materials, stone, ceramic, fiber, and cave walls, the same tension repeats itself, between what is confirmed and what is perceived, between documented history and the spaces where interpretation quietly expands. From the weathered contours of Pedra da Gávea, where erosion has carved forms that blur the line between geology and interpretation, the narrative once again shifts across hemispheres. The Atlantic winds fall away, replaced by the dense humidity of the southeastern woodlands of North America. Here, in the Appalachian foothills of western North Carolina, stone lies low to the ground rather than towering above it. And yet, the sense of mystery remains just as grounded, just as persistent. Hidden within a quiet valley near the Tuckasegee River basin is a massive soapstone boulder known as Judaculla rock. Unlike monumental peaks or subterranean caves, this site does not demand attention through scale or depth. Instead, it reveals itself slowly, through surface detail, through engraved patterning, and through centuries of layered observation. The rock itself is large, flat, and covered in hundreds, possibly thousands, of petroglyph markings. Spirals, grooves, cup-like depressions, linear cuts, and abstract shapes spread across its surface in dense clusters. Weathered by time and partially softened by natural erosion, the carvings still hold enough definition to suggest deliberate placement, though their original clarity has inevitably faded across centuries. Archaeological consensus places many of these carvings within the cultural traditions of indigenous peoples of the region, with some elements potentially dating back hundreds or even over 1,000 years. The site is often associated with ancestral Cherokee oral traditions, in which Judaculla is described as a powerful, otherworldly being connected to the landscape itself. In these narratives, the rock is not merely a surface for carving, it is part of a larger mythological geography, where natural formations and cultural memory intertwine. From a scientific perspective, the petroglyphs are generally interpreted as symbolic expressions, possibly related to territorial markers, ritual activity, astronomical observation, or storytelling traditions encoded into stone. The diversity of motifs suggests multiple phases of carving over extended periods, rather than a single moment of creation. Some patterns resemble known indigenous symbolic systems, while others remain more abstract, resisting definitive classification. Yet even within established frameworks, interpretation is not always straightforward. The surface of Judaculla rock is unusually dense in markings compared to many other petroglyph sites in the Appalachian region. This density raises questions not only about meaning, but about process. Why this particular boulder? Why such concentration of imagery in one location? And how did successive generations engage with the same surface without obscuring earlier layers entirely? Some researchers suggest that the rock may have functioned as a long-term cultural canvas, revisited repeatedly across generations. In this view, the surface becomes cumulative, a record not of a single message, but of ongoing interaction between people and place. Each carving adds to an evolving visual archive, where older symbols remain visible beneath newer additions, creating a stratified language of stone. Still, there are aspects that invite broader speculation. Certain spirals and geometric patterns have been compared, in fringe interpretations, to astronomical diagrams or landscape mapping systems. Others have suggested that the density and arrangement of carvings could reflect mnemonic devices, memory aids used to preserve oral traditions across time. These ideas remain outside mainstream archaeological consensus, yet they persist in discussions precisely because the full communicative structure of the petroglyphs is not entirely understood. One of the challenges in interpreting sites like Judaculla rock lies in the absence of a direct translation key. Unlike written languages that can be decoded through bilingual inscriptions or historical continuity, petroglyph systems often exist without surviving explanatory frameworks. Meaning, if it once existed in structured form, is now filtered through fragmentary cultural transmission and archaeological interpretation. And yet, the rock itself remains physically stable, even as interpretation shifts around it. Modern preservation efforts have sought to protect the site from erosion, visitor impact, and environmental degradation. Documentation through photography, 3D scanning, and comparative analysis has allowed researchers to map the carvings in greater detail than ever before. But even high-resolution recording does not resolve the fundamental question of meaning. It only preserves the surface of the question itself. Within Cherokee tradition, Judaculla is not merely an archaeological site, but part of a living cultural landscape. Stories associated with the rock speak of a powerful being whose presence shaped the surrounding terrain, leaving behind marks that connect land, water, and spiritual identity. In this context, the carvings are not puzzles to be solved, but expressions of relationship between people, land, and memory. This duality, between scientific interpretation and cultural narrative, adds another layer of complexity. It raises an important consideration: whether the search for a single explanatory framework is always appropriate when dealing with culturally significant landscapes that may hold multiple layers of meaning simultaneously. As with many sites across this global journey, from cave systems in South America to mountain faces in Brazil, from knotted cords in the Andes to disputed artifacts in Asia, the question is not only what the markings are, but how they are understood across different systems of knowledge. Are the petroglyphs primarily records, symbols, stories, or something that does not translate neatly into modern categories of interpretation? And if meaning was once embedded in practices that are no longer fully accessible, what remains visible now? Artifact, abstraction, or something in between? Standing before the worn surface of Judaculla rock, one is left not with resolution, but with continuity. The carvings do not announce themselves. They persist quietly, layered across time, shaped by both human hand and natural erosion. And so the question remains, embedded in stone that still holds its patterns despite centuries of change. How much of what is visible here belongs to memory, and how much belongs to interpretation? And where, if anywhere, does the boundary between the two truly begin? From the weathered surface of Judaculla rock, where thousands of carved marks blur the boundary between memory and landscape, the narrative continues its quiet descent into another corner of archaeological ambiguity. The setting changes again, not in scale alone, but in atmosphere. From open-air stone in a temperate valley to cold, mineral darkness beneath the Earth's surface. In the limestone heart of Lebanon's mountain range lies one of the most extraordinary cave systems in the eastern Mediterranean, Dzheita Grotto. Known for its vast chambers, underground rivers, and cathedral-like formations of stalactites and stalagmites, this subterranean world has been shaped over millions of years by the slow persistence of water moving through rock. Within this environment, where silence is broken only by dripping water and distant echoes, there have been occasional references in alternative literature to unusual carved or inscribed objects reportedly associated with nearby cave zones. These are often referred to collectively as the Dzheita inscribed objects, though this name itself does not appear in formal archaeological catalogs and remains largely confined to speculative accounts and secondary discussions rather than established excavation reports. Unlike the well-documented geological formations of Dzheita Grotto, these so-called inscribed objects occupy a far more uncertain space in the historical record. Descriptions vary significantly depending on the source. Some accounts suggest small stone fragments or carved pieces allegedly discovered in proximity to cave systems in the region. Others describe objects bearing faint markings or geometric impressions that some have interpreted as symbolic or proto-writing elements. However, in mainstream archaeology, there is no verified, peer-reviewed record confirming the existence of a distinct artifact class under this designation. The absence of standardized documentation makes it difficult to place these claims within an established cultural or chronological framework. As with many disputed or poorly sourced discoveries, the line between artifact, misinterpretation, and later narrative construction becomes increasingly difficult to define. Still, the idea persists in fringe and speculative discussions precisely because of the environment in which it is situated. Cave systems like Dzheita are not static spaces. They are dynamic geological formations, continuously shaped by water flow, mineral deposition, and erosion. Over time, natural processes can produce patterns that resemble intentional carving, parallel lines, intersecting grooves, and textured surfaces that, under low-light conditions, may appear structured or symbolic. In environments where visibility is limited and surfaces are irregular, the human mind often organizes what it sees into familiar forms. This phenomenon is not unique to Lebanon. Across many archaeological contexts, from desert rock shelters to deep cave systems, researchers have documented instances where natural markings were initially interpreted as human-made inscriptions, only to be reclassified after closer geological analysis. The challenge lies not in whether patterns exist, but in how intention is determined. In the case of the so-called Dzheita inscribed objects, the uncertainty is compounded by the lack of a clearly defined excavation context. Without stratigraphic data, controlled recovery records, or consistent typological classification, interpretation remains speculative. What is being described may represent a range of possibilities: natural formations misidentified as artifacts, displaced cultural materials from nearby regions, or objects whose original context has been lost over time. And yet, even within this uncertainty, the narrative continues to circulate. Some interpretations propose that these objects, if they exist as described, could be remnants of local cultural practices that have not survived in written historical records. The Levant, after all, has been a crossroads of civilizations for millennia, where trade routes, migrations, and cultural exchanges overlapped in complex and sometimes poorly documented ways. In such a region, it is not unreasonable to expect that not all material culture has been fully preserved or understood. Others take a more speculative approach, suggesting that unusual markings in cave environments might represent symbolic systems tied to ritual or environmental observation, possibly used by small, localized groups whose traditions did not persist into recorded history. These ideas remain hypothetical, lacking direct evidence, but they reflect broader questions about how much of human cultural expression may have been transient or geographically limited. Mainstream archaeology, however, remains grounded in what can be verified. In the case of Dzheita and its surrounding region, extensive geological and archaeological studies have focused primarily on the cave system's natural formation and its significance as a hydrological and touristic landmark. The grotto itself is widely recognized as one of Lebanon's most important natural wonders, with no confirmed association to inscribed artifact assemblages of the type described in speculative accounts. Still, the persistence of these narratives highlights a recurring theme across many sites in this broader exploration: the tension between observation and interpretation. When an object lacks clear provenance, when markings are ambiguous, and when documentation is incomplete, meaning does not disappear. It disperses. It moves into the space between disciplines, where geology, archaeology, folklore, and modern storytelling intersect. In that space, certainty becomes harder to anchor. And so the question remains less about what has been definitively found, and more about how fragments of observation evolve into narratives over time. What begins as an indistinct marking on stone can, through repetition and reinterpretation, become something far more structured in cultural memory than it may have been in physical reality. Standing at the edge of this uncertainty, one is left to consider not only the possibility of undiscovered artifacts, but also the processes by which stories of such artifacts come into being. Are they rooted in forgotten material evidence, misread geological formations, or the natural human tendency to seek pattern and meaning in ambiguity? And as the journey continues beyond the illuminated chambers of Dzheita Grotto, the silence it leaves behind feels less like absence, and more like an unanswered question still waiting within the stone. From the dim, echoing corridors of Dzheita Grotto, where water has sculpted stone over millions of years into vast underground chambers, the journey of inquiry moves once again across continents and deep into geological time itself. This time, the narrative does not descend into caves or rise along mountain faces. Instead, it sinks far beneath the surface of the earth, into strata so ancient that human history becomes a brief flicker above them. In the mining regions near Autostal, within the far older geological formations of the Transvaal region, objects have been brought to public attention that defy easy categorization in popular discussion. Known widely as the Klerksdorp Spheres, these small, rounded formations are found embedded in ancient pyrophyllite deposits, a soft mineral rock formed through volcanic sedimentation and metamorphic processes over billions of years. At first glance, they appear deceptively simple. Small, metallic gray or reddish spheres, often no larger than a few centimeters in diameter, some slightly flattened, others more symmetrical. A number of them display parallel grooves or bands encircling their surfaces, as if deliberately etched or machined with precision tools. It is this visual impression that has drawn sustained attention beyond geological circles. From a scientific standpoint, The formations are understood as naturally occurring concretions, mineral masses that form through the gradual precipitation of dissolved minerals around a central nucleus within sedimentary rock. Over immense spans of time, pressure, chemical composition, and mineral saturation can produce shapes that appear surprisingly regular. In some cases, erosion exposes these concretions in ways that make them appear isolated, as if placed rather than formed. Geologists studying the deposits near Ottosdal emphasize that such formations are not unique to this region. Similar concretions have been documented in various parts of the world, each shaped by local environmental conditions. What distinguishes the Klerksdorp examples in public fascination is not necessarily their existence, but their appearance, particularly the symmetry and banding observed on certain specimens. Yet perception often extends beyond classification. In popular and alternative interpretations, the spheres are sometimes described as anomalous artifacts, with suggestions ranging from prehistoric craftsmanship to unknown technological processes. Some claims propose that the grooves indicate mechanical precision inconsistent with natural formation, while others suggest that their age and geological context challenge conventional timelines of Earth's development. These interpretations, however, are not supported by mainstream geological analysis. The scientific consensus remains that the spheres are natural concretions formed approximately 3 billion years ago within Precambrian rock formations. The apparent grooves are typically attributed to mineral banding, crystal growth patterns, or differential erosion along structural weaknesses in the material. Still, even within established explanations, there is an acknowledgement of how easily natural processes can produce forms that mimic artificial design. Geology, in its deep time perspective, often generates structures that echo patterns familiar to human perception: circles, layers, symmetry, without requiring intentional construction. This is where the Klerksdorp spheres become more than a geological curiosity. They become a study in perception itself. When removed from their stratigraphic context and viewed in isolation, these objects can appear disconnected from the slow processes that formed them. But within their geological layer, they are part of a continuous system of sedimentation, pressure, and mineral transformation that unfolded long before the emergence of humans. And yet, the tension between context and appearance remains central to their story. Why do certain natural formations invite such persistent reinterpretation? Part of the answer lies in the human cognitive tendency to recognize patterns, even in randomness. This phenomenon, known as pareidolia, is not limited to visual illusions in clouds or landscapes. It extends into how we interpret physical objects whose origins are not immediately obvious. The spheres, therefore, occupy a unique space between geology and imagination. Their simplicity makes them easy to isolate visually, while their symmetry invites assumptions of design. But their scientific explanation does not erase their capacity to provoke questions. Some speculative interpretations extend beyond geology entirely, suggesting that the spheres might represent remnants of unknown technological processes or artifacts from hypothetical ancient civilizations. These ideas exist primarily outside academic literature and are not supported by empirical evidence. However, their persistence reflects a broader cultural pattern: the desire to find complexity where understanding feels incomplete. In contrast, geological studies continue to focus on measurable processes, chemical composition, formation environments, and comparative analysis with other known concretions worldwide. Under microscopic and geochemical examination, the structures of the Klerksdorp specimens align with natural mineral growth patterns rather than manufactured surfaces. And yet, even when explanations are provided, the visual impression remains powerful. There is something about holding an object that is billions of years old, something formed long before multicellular life existed, that challenges intuitive understanding. Time, in this context, is not linear in human terms. It becomes layered, compressed into stone, revealing a planet that has undergone continuous transformation far beyond human observation. The Klerksdorp Spheres, whether viewed as geological concretions or as objects of interpretive fascination, ultimately reflect this deeper reality: that Earth itself is capable of producing forms that resemble intention without requiring it. But even this understanding does not fully dissolve the questions they raise. When natural processes create shapes that mimic design so closely, where does interpretation begin and end? At what point does familiarity with pattern override awareness of deep time? And how many other objects, buried within ancient rock layers, might still challenge the boundary between what is formed and what is perceived? As the narrative continues beyond the mineral depths of Ottosdal, the spheres remain quietly embedded in geological history, unchanging, unaltered, and still prompting the same fundamental reflection, whether meaning lies within the object itself or within the eyes that attempt to understand it. From the ancient mineral formations of Klerksdorp Spheres, objects shaped not by tools but by deep geological time, the narrative shifts once again across continents. The focus moves away from stone formed before complex life, away from natural processes spanning billions of years, and returns to a very different kind of mystery, one tied not to geology alone, but to human claims, contested discovery, and the fragile boundary between artifact and controversy. In the rural landscape of southern Illinois, near the quiet terrain surrounding Rosiclare and the broader Ohio River Valley, a name occasionally surfaces in alternative archaeological discussions: Burrows Cave. Unlike established archaeological sites with layered excavation records and peer-reviewed documentation, Burrows Cave occupies an uncertain position in modern discourse, known more through testimony, private claims, and circulating artifact descriptions than through formally published archaeological surveys. The narrative begins in the late 20th century, when claims emerged regarding the discovery of a concealed cave reportedly containing a vast collection of carved stone artifacts. According to these accounts, the objects included engraved tablets, figurines, and inscribed stones bearing symbols that some have described as resembling Old World writing systems. These claims were associated with a private individual who reported the discovery, but did not produce a fully documented excavation record consistent with standard archaeological methodology. As a result, Burrows Cave has remained outside academic consensus, with its artifacts, often referred to collectively as Burrows Cave artifacts, existing primarily within secondary reports, photographs of uncertain provenance, and discussions in independent research communities. Descriptions of the artifacts vary, but they frequently include carved limestone or sandstone objects with engraved human figures, animals, and symbolic patterns. Some depictions appear stylistically reminiscent of Mediterranean or Near Eastern iconography, leading to speculative interpretations that suggest possible transoceanic contact in pre-Columbian times. Others resemble more generalized symbolic forms that could be interpreted within multiple cultural frameworks, depending on perspective and context. However, the absence of controlled excavation data makes definitive classification difficult. In archaeology, context is essential. Without stratigraphic recording, secure provenance, or verifiable excavation conditions, artifacts cannot be confidently assigned to specific cultures or time periods. This is the central challenge surrounding Burrows Cave. The objects themselves, as described, are not analyzed within a documented archaeological layer, but rather within a narrative constructed after their reported discovery. Mainstream researchers therefore approach the subject with caution. The lack of peer-reviewed publication, verifiable excavation methodology, and consistent artifact documentation means that the material cannot currently be integrated into established frameworks of North American prehistory. In this view, The cave remains unconfirmed as an archaeological site in the scientific sense. Yet the story persists. Part of what sustains interest in Burrows Cave is the visual nature of the reported artifacts. According to descriptions and circulated images, some carvings appear detailed and deliberate, depicting human-like figures in arranged scenes. Others show geometric patterns or inscriptions that invite comparison to known writing systems from distant regions. These visual similarities have fueled speculation in fringe literature, where the artifacts are sometimes interpreted as evidence of ancient contact between geographically distant civilizations. These interpretations remain highly controversial and are not supported by mainstream archaeological evidence. However, they reflect a broader pattern seen across many debated discoveries. When visual complexity appears to suggest meaning, interpretation often extends beyond what can be verified. Alternative explanations propose that the artifacts may be modern creations, either intentionally fabricated or misattributed. Others suggest that they could originate from unknown or misidentified cultural sources within North America, later removed from their original context and reintroduced into a narrative that obscures their true origin. Still others argue that without access to the original discovery site and full documentation, no definitive conclusion can be reached at all. In this space of uncertainty, Burrows Cave becomes less about confirmed archaeology and more about the dynamics of evidence, narrative, and belief. What distinguishes it from many other debated sites is not necessarily the nature of the artifacts themselves, but the absence of consensus around their origin. Unlike well-documented archaeological discoveries, where multiple independent studies converge on interpretation, Burrows Cave exists largely in isolation from formal academic validation. This does not automatically negate every claim associated with it, but it does place the material outside the boundaries of established scientific confirmation. And yet, the human tendency to seek coherence in fragmented information remains strong. When images, descriptions, and partial accounts circulate without complete context, they can form a narrative that feels structured even in the absence of verification. This is not unique to archaeology. It is a broader feature of how information is processed, especially when it involves the past, the unknown, or the visually compelling. Within this framework, Burrows Cave occupies a liminal space. It is neither fully integrated into academic archaeology nor entirely dismissed in public imagination. Instead, it remains suspended between categories: artifact, claim, and controversy. Even the location itself, associated with the Ohio River Valley region near Rosiclare, is archaeologically significant in its own right, having been home to numerous indigenous cultures over millennia. This broader context adds complexity to any discussion of unverified artifacts, as the region's deep cultural history is well established, even if specific claims about Burrows Cave are not. So the question becomes less about whether extraordinary artifacts exist in isolation, and more about how claims of discovery are evaluated, preserved, and understood within the broader archaeological process. What defines an artifact as authentic? Is it the object itself, its material composition, its visual complexity, or the framework of evidence that surrounds its discovery? And when that framework is incomplete or absent, what remains? History, interpretation, or something that still waits in the silence between the two? From the disputed narrative surrounding Burrows Cave, where claims of carved artifacts remain suspended between testimony and verification, the exploration shifts once again across continents and into a very different archaeological setting. The atmosphere changes, from contested modern discovery in North America to the quiet, sediment-rich shores of an ancient lake in southeastern Europe, where time itself appears to have been gently preserved beneath layers of mud and water. On the banks of what was once a vast prehistoric lake in northern Greece, near the modern village of Dispilio, archaeologists uncovered the remnants of a Neolithic settlement remarkably preserved in waterlogged sediment. This site, known for its wooden structures, pottery fragments, and organic materials, offers a rare glimpse into human life thousands of years before written history in the region fully emerged. Among these finds was a small wooden object that would later draw significant attention in both academic and alternative discussions, the so-called Dispilio Tablet. At first glance, the tablet is unassuming. A fragment of wood, worn by time, its surface marked with a series of carved symbols and incised lines. It is fragile, darkened by millennia of submersion, and shaped not as a monumental artifact, but as something personal and functional, an object once held, touched, and possibly used in daily life. Radiocarbon dating of the surrounding archaeological layer places the site broadly in the Neolithic period, around the 6th millennium BC, though precise dating of the tablet itself remains complex due to preservation conditions and the nature of organic material recovery. The settlement at Dispilio is widely recognized as one of the earliest known examples of organized human habitation in the region, complete with structural remains and evidence of sustained community life. But it is the markings on the wooden tablet that have sparked sustained curiosity. The incisions appear to form repeated patterns, lines, intersecting shapes, and arrangements that some researchers have attempted to interpret as symbolic communication. The natural question arises: could these markings represent an early form of notation, proto-writing, or symbolic record-keeping? Mainstream archaeological interpretation remains cautious. While the tablet is acknowledged as significant, most scholars emphasize that the markings are not definitively proven to constitute a writing system. Instead, they may represent symbolic decoration, tally marks, ownership indicators, or ritual notation, none of which necessarily imply structured language in the linguistic sense. This caution is important, particularly because the emergence of writing is a complex and regionally varied process. In many parts of the world, symbolic marking systems existed long before fully developed writing systems appeared. Distinguishing between decoration, symbolism, and structured communication is one of the most challenging tasks in interpreting early material culture. Yet the Dispilio tablet continues to invite deeper questions. In alternative interpretations, the markings have sometimes been described as evidence of an early, possibly lost stage in the development of written communication in the region. Some suggest that it could represent a transitional system, an intermediary step between symbolic representation and structured script. Others propose that it reflects a localized communication method that did not evolve into a broader writing tradition and therefore left no surviving descendants. These ideas remain speculative and are not part of established consensus. However, they highlight an important aspect of archaeological interpretation: the recognition that not all forms of communication leave behind clear, linear progressions into later history. The wooden nature of the artifact itself adds another layer of complexity. Unlike stone inscriptions or fired clay tablets, organic materials are far less likely to survive over millennia unless preserved under exceptional conditions. The waterlogged environment of Dispilio provided such a rare preservation context, effectively sealing organic remains away from oxygen and decay. Without this unique environmental condition, objects like the tablet would likely have vanished entirely from the archaeological record. This raises an important consideration. How many similar artifacts have been lost simply due to the fragility of their material? And how much of early symbolic or communicative behavior remains invisible to us because it was recorded on perishable surfaces? Within this uncertainty, the Dispilio tablet occupies a delicate position. It is neither a fully understood text nor an ordinary decorative object. It sits instead at the intersection of interpretation, where archaeology meets linguistics, and where material evidence meets the limits of modern understanding. Some researchers have attempted comparative analysis with other early symbolic systems from the broader region, noting abstract similarities in line structure and repetition patterns. Others caution that such comparisons risk imposing later interpretive frameworks onto much earlier and culturally distinct material. What remains consistent across all interpretations is the recognition that the tablet reflects intentional human action. The marks were made deliberately, by human hands, at a time when communities in the region were developing increasingly complex forms of social organization, settlement patterns, and material expression. But intention does not always equate to decipherable meaning in the present. The challenge lies in reconstructing context that no longer exists in complete form. Without a known reference system, without bilingual inscriptions or continuous cultural transmission, meaning becomes an exercise in careful inference rather than direct translation. And so the tablet remains quietly suspended in time, a fragment of wood from a lakeside settlement that once existed in a world very different from our own, yet still recognizable in its human gestures. It invites reflection rather than resolution. What was once inscribed into its surface may have been understood instantly by those who lived alongside it, readable within a shared system of knowledge now lost to time. Or perhaps it was never meant to be read in the way modern eyes expect, but instead functioned within a broader cultural or symbolic framework that no longer survives. And as the exploration continues beyond the still waters of Dispilio, one question lingers gently beneath the surface. How many early forms of human expression have disappeared, not because they were insignificant, but simply because the materials that carried them were never meant to endure? From the waterlogged wooden fragment of Dispilio Tablet, where faint incisions hint at communication preserved by rare environmental chance, the journey of inquiry moves northward once again. The still lakes of prehistoric Greece fade into memory, replaced by the rolling plains of southeastern Europe, where river valleys carve slow paths through time-worn soil and ancient settlement layers lie buried beneath modern fields. In the region of Transylvania, near the modern village of Tărtăria, archaeologists in the mid-20th century uncovered a small but extraordinary assemblage of artifacts buried within a Neolithic context. Among pottery fragments, figurines, and human remains, 3 small clay tablets emerged from the soil, objects that would come to be known as the Tărtăria Tablets. At first glance, they are unassuming. Flattened pieces of fired clay, worn by time, their surfaces etched with compact arrangements of symbols. One is round, the others rectangular, each bearing incised markings that appear deliberate and structured. Alongside them, a figurine and a bracelet-like object were also recovered, all placed within what was interpreted as a ritual or funerary context. Radiocarbon dating of the surrounding archaeological layer initially suggested a very early Neolithic time frame, potentially placing the context around the 6th millennium BC. If accurate, this would position the tablets among some of the earliest known instances of symbolic inscription in Europe, and possibly the world. However, this early dating has been the subject of debate, as questions have been raised regarding stratigraphic disturbance and the complexity of accurately dating associated materials in mixed burial contexts. The markings themselves are what continue to draw attention. On the surface of the tablets, incised symbols appear arranged in linear and segmented patterns. Some resemble abstract geometric forms. Others evoke simplified representations of objects or ideograms. Unlike later, fully developed writing systems, there is no clear grammatical structure that allows for direct translation. Instead, the symbols exist in isolation, suggestive, repetitive, but not definitively readable. Mainstream archaeological interpretation approaches the Tărtăria Tablets with careful restraint. Many scholars view them as examples of early symbolic expression, possibly related to ritual practices, ownership marking, or communal identity. In this view, the tablets represent an important stage in the development of human symbolic behavior, but not necessarily a fully formed writing system. This distinction is crucial. The emergence of writing is not a single event, but a gradual process that unfolded independently in different regions of the world. In Mesopotamia, for example, structured writing systems such as early cuneiform emerged later in the 4th millennium BC, evolving from earlier accounting tokens and pictographic systems. The question raised by the Tărtăria Tablets is whether similar developmental steps might have occurred earlier or differently in southeastern Europe. This is where interpretation becomes more complex. Some researchers have proposed that the symbols on the tablets may represent an early proto-writing system, potentially predating other known writing traditions. This interpretation suggests that the region may have experienced an independent development of symbolic communication that did not survive into later historical continuity. However, this remains highly debated, as the evidence is limited and open to multiple readings. Other scholars emphasize the possibility that the tablets were not writing in the linguistic sense at all. Instead, they may have functioned within ritual contexts, objects embedded in symbolic systems that communicated meaning through context, placement, and shared cultural understanding rather than direct textual encoding. The archaeological context adds another layer of intrigue. The tablets were reportedly discovered in association with a burial site, alongside human remains and ritual objects. Such contexts often indicate symbolic or ceremonial significance, where objects are placed not for everyday use, but for meanings tied to death, identity, or spiritual belief systems. In this framework, the symbols on the tablets may not have been intended for linear reading, but rather for participation in a broader ritual language now lost to time. Yet uncertainty persists, in part because the excavation conditions themselves have been debated. Questions regarding stratigraphy, disturbance of soil layers, and the complexity of interpreting mixed archaeological deposits have led some researchers to call for caution when assigning precise chronological significance to the artifacts. Despite these debates, the Tărtăria Tablets continue to occupy a unique position in discussions of early human symbolic development. They sit at the boundary between image and language, between artifact and script, between ritual object and communicative tool. And it is precisely this ambiguity that sustains their significance. When viewed in isolation, the symbols appear structured. When placed within broader archaeological comparisons, they resist easy classification. They neither fully align with later writing systems, nor entirely dissolve into purely decorative patterns. Instead, they remain suspended in an interpretive space where meaning is suggested but not confirmed. Some alternative perspectives have gone further, proposing connections between the tablets and other early symbolic traditions across distant regions. These ideas often suggest diffusion or parallel development of writing-like systems across prehistoric Europe and neighboring regions. However, such theories remain speculative and are not supported by consensus archaeological evidence. Mainstream interpretations continue to emphasize caution, pointing out that without a larger corpus of similar inscriptions or a bilingual reference system, translation is not possible. A single set of artifacts, however compelling visually, cannot establish a fully functional writing system on its own. Still, the tablets resist final closure. They are small enough to be held in the hand, yet dense enough in implication to expand into broader questions about the origins of communication itself. If humans in this region were experimenting with symbolic inscription as early as the 6th millennium BC, what other forms of expression might have existed that have not survived? And if these markings are not writing, what alternative systems of meaning once structured their world? Standing at the intersection of interpretation and uncertainty, the Tărtăria Tablets remain quietly unresolved. They do not declare their meaning. They suggest it. And in that suggestion lies the enduring mystery. Whether the earliest attempts to fix thought into material form were already closer to writing than we can currently prove, or whether they represent something entirely different, waiting for a language we have not yet learned to recognize. From the clay impressions of the Tărtăria Tablets, where the earliest hints of symbolic thought seem to emerge from the soil of southeastern Europe, the narrative shifts once again across continents and altitudes. The plains of Transylvania fade into memory, replaced by the vast, high Andean plateau of South America, where air is thin, light is sharp, and stone landscapes stretch toward horizons that feel almost unreal in their stillness. Near the shores of Lake Titicaca, close to the modern borderlands shaped by Peru and Bolivia, the terrain rises into rocky formations that have long been part of local oral traditions and sacred geography. Among these formations lies a carved structure known as Aramu Muru, often referred to in modern accounts as the Aramu Muru doorway. At first glance, it appears as a large, flat stone face embedded into the hillside. Smoothly cut into the natural rock is a rectangular recess, framed with shallow grooves that give the impression of a doorway or portal-like opening. The surface is weathered, yet the geometry of the carving remains strikingly deliberate. It does not resemble a natural erosion pattern, nor does it immediately align with typical architectural remains found in the region. And yet, despite its unusual form, no confirmed archaeological excavation has definitively established its origin, date, or cultural attribution. In mainstream archaeological understanding, the site is treated with caution. The broader region around Lake Titicaca is known for its rich pre-Columbian history, including the development of complex civilizations such as the Tiwanaku culture. These societies are recognized for their advanced stone masonry, ceremonial centers, and astronomical alignments. Within this context, carved rock formations and ritual sites are not uncommon. However, Aramu Muru does not neatly fit into established typologies of known Inca or pre-Inca construction. There are no associated structural complexes, no clearly documented stratigraphic layers, and no widely accepted inscriptions that can definitively link the carving to a specific culture or period. This absence of contextual anchors is what has allowed interpretation to remain open and, in some cases, speculative. Local oral traditions associated with the broader region speak of sacred spaces where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds becomes permeable. In some versions of these narratives, rock formations are described not merely as geological features, but as places of transition, thresholds where communication with ancestral or non-physical realms becomes possible. Within this cultural landscape, structures like Aramu Muru are often understood symbolically rather than architecturally. From a geological perspective, the formation itself is carved into sandstone and volcanic rock, materials that are relatively soft and responsive to both natural erosion and human modification. Wind, water, and temperature fluctuations over long periods can produce surface irregularities, while human intervention can further shape and refine existing features. Distinguishing between natural formation and deliberate carving in such environments can be challenging without detailed archaeological excavation. And yet, the geometry of the doorway continues to invite questions. The rectangular recess, often cited as the most distinctive feature, appears too regular to be easily dismissed as random erosion by some observers. The symmetry of its proportions, the apparent smoothing of its inner surface, and the surrounding shallow grooves contribute to its visual impression as a constructed feature. But visual impression alone is not sufficient evidence of origin, and archaeology consistently emphasizes the importance of context over appearance. Still, the site has become a focal point for alternative interpretations. In modern fringe literature, Aramu Muru is sometimes described as a portal or interdimensional gateway, a concept that draws more from metaphysical speculation than archaeological analysis. These interpretations often point to the absence of known structural function and the symbolic association of doorways in many cultures as thresholds between worlds. Other interpretations suggest that the carving may have served a ceremonial or ritual purpose, possibly functioning as a symbolic representation of passage, transition, or connection to the spiritual landscape of the Andes. In this view, the doorway is not meant to be physically entered, but conceptually understood within a system of belief that no longer survives in complete form. Yet there remains no consensus on its function, and no definitive archaeological publication has confirmed its original purpose. Part of the difficulty in interpreting Aramu Muru lies in the broader challenge of reading carved landscapes without accompanying material evidence. Unlike artifacts found in stratified excavation layers, isolated rock carvings exist outside of direct contextual association. They are embedded in the landscape itself, exposed to centuries or millennia of environmental change, human visitation, and cultural reinterpretation. This makes them particularly vulnerable to shifting narratives over time. What begins as a local landmark can gradually accumulate layers of meaning, spiritual, historical, speculative, each reflecting the worldview of those interpreting it rather than necessarily the intention of its original creators. In this way, Aramu Muru becomes not only a physical site, but also a cultural mirror reflecting changing ideas about ancient knowledge, sacred geography, and the limits of archaeological certainty. And yet, even within scientific caution, there is acknowledgement of something undeniable. The carving exists. It is real, tangible, and embedded in a landscape already rich with ancient human presence. The question is not whether the stone has been shaped, but when, how, and for what purpose. Could it be part of a larger but undocumented architectural tradition now lost to time? Could it be a natural formation enhanced by human hands for ritual or symbolic reasons? Or could it represent something far simpler, later imbued with meaning far beyond its original intent? Each possibility remains open, none fully confirmed. As the wind moves across the high plateau of Lake Titicaca, the carved outline of Aramu Muru stands quietly against the rock face, unchanging, unverified in its origin, yet deeply compelling in its form. And so the question remains, not as an answer waiting to be revealed, but as a silence built into stone itself. When a shape resembles a threshold so closely, is it ever just a coincidence of geology and erosion, or does it reflect something that once carried meaning now beyond our ability to fully recover? From the carved rock face of Aramu Muru, where the idea of a doorway is etched into stone and imagination alike, the narrative shifts once more across the vast Andean plateau. The altitude remains extreme, but the landscape changes character. The terrain opens outward, no longer defined by singular monoliths or isolated carvings, but by something far more expansive, something only fully visible from above. In the high plains of western Bolivia, near the volcanic slopes surrounding Sajama National Park, the ground stretches into a wide, arid expanse of altiplano. Snow-capped peaks rise in the distance, including the dormant volcano Nevado Sajama, the highest summit in Bolivia. The air is thin, the soil dry, and the horizon seems to flatten the world into an immense, open canvas. It is here that one of the most enigmatic landscape features of the Andes quietly unfolds: the Sajama Lines. At ground level, they are almost invisible. The lines appear as faint, narrow paths etched into the earth, long, straight corridors cutting across the desert surface. They stretch for kilometers, sometimes intersecting, sometimes running parallel, forming a vast and intricate network that covers hundreds of square kilometers. Unlike raised structures or carved reliefs, these are negative spaces, paths cleared of vegetation and stones, exposing the earth beneath in deliberate linear formations. From above, however, their scale becomes unmistakable. When viewed from elevated terrain or aerial perspective, the Sajama Lines reveal a geometric precision that is difficult to ignore. Thousands upon thousands of straight pathways radiate across the landscape, forming one of the largest known networks of geoglyphs in the world. Yet unlike the more widely known geoglyphs of Nazca lines, these lines are not formed by deep carving or contrasting soil coloration, but by the careful removal of surface stones and vegetation along precise trajectories. Archaeological studies suggest that the lines were created over many centuries, likely beginning as early as pre-Columbian times. Local indigenous communities, particularly Aymara-speaking groups, are believed to have contributed to their construction and maintenance. Rather than being a single monumental project, the lines appear to represent a cumulative process, paths repeatedly cleared and preserved across generations. In this interpretation, the Sajama lines are not static symbols but living features of cultural practice. Mainstream archaeological perspectives generally propose that the lines had multiple functions. Some researchers suggest they may have served as ritual pathways, used in pilgrimages or ceremonial processions connecting sacred sites across the landscape. Others propose practical functions, such as routes linking water sources, settlements, and grazing areas in an otherwise harsh and sparsely vegetated environment. The sheer density of the network supports the idea that these were not isolated paths, but part of an extensive system of movement and interaction. The repetition of straight lines across uneven terrain suggests intentional design, even if that design served more than one purpose over time. Yet questions remain. Why maintain such an extensive network of linear pathways in a landscape where modern mapping reveals no single centralized origin point? Why invest effort into preserving straightness across kilometers of uneven terrain, especially in an environment shaped by wind, erosion, and seasonal change? Some interpretations propose that the lines may reflect a cosmological or symbolic understanding of space. In this view, the act of walking straight lines across the earth is not merely practical or logistical, but deeply connected to spiritual geography. Movement itself becomes a form of expression, each line a trace of human interaction with sacred land. Within indigenous Andean worldviews, landscapes are often understood as living entities, where mountains, rivers, and plains possess spiritual significance. In such frameworks, pathways may function as more than routes. They may represent relationships between places of importance, forming a network that connects not only physical locations, but also layers of meaning. Alternative interpretations, often found in speculative literature, suggest that the geometric precision of the Sajama lines could indicate a form of large-scale planning whose full purpose is no longer understood. Some have even proposed that the network reflects astronomical alignments or environmental mapping systems, though these ideas remain unverified within academic archaeology. What is widely accepted, however, is that the lines are ancient, intentional, and culturally significant. Their maintenance over centuries implies continuity of practice, even as the societies that shaped them evolved and transformed. Unlike monumental architecture, which asserts presence through height and mass, the Sajama lines exist through absence, the removal of material to define direction. They are not built upward, but drawn outward, not enclosed, but extended. In this sense, they represent a different kind of human expression, one that engages with landscape not as backdrop, but as medium. And yet, their full meaning remains elusive. Modern aerial surveys and satellite imagery have helped reveal the true scale of the network, but visibility alone does not equate to understanding. Even as technology uncovers patterns invisible to the ground-level observer, it does not fully resolve questions of intention. The lines are visible, measurable, and documented, but their original conceptual framework remains partially hidden within time. Standing in the Altiplano today, the lines fade into the terrain unless one already knows where to look. Wind sweeps across the plateau, and the earth slowly shifts, but the paths persist, maintained either by human activity, environmental conditions, or both. And so the landscape holds its quiet geometry, stretching across the high Andes near Sajama National Park, a vast network of straightness carved not into stone, but into the surface of the earth itself. The question that remains is not only what the lines were used for, but how meaning is preserved in a system that depends on movement, repetition, and memory rather than fixed monument. When a landscape becomes a map drawn over generations, where does the original intention begin, and where does interpretation take over? From the vast, high-altitude geometry of the Sajama Lines, where entire landscapes appear to have been carefully traced across the Earth itself, the narrative shifts once again across continents. The scale contracts dramatically. From hundreds of kilometers of open Andean plateau, the focus narrows to a single carved surface in a temperate, rain-soaked corner of northern Europe, where stone lies close to the ground, and time is recorded not in sweeping lines, but in intricate markings pressed into rock. In West Dunbartonshire, Scotland, on a gentle hillside overlooking the surrounding lowlands, lies a large sandstone slab known as the Cochno Stone. At first glance, it appears like an ordinary outcrop, partially embedded in grass and soil, weathered by centuries of wind and rain. But upon closer inspection, its surface reveals something far more deliberate: a dense field of carved geometric patterns, carefully etched into the stone. Spirals, circles, interlocking rings, cup marks. Radial designs that seem to repeat across the surface in structured arrangements. The stone is not small. It spans several meters, and its carvings cover much of its exposed face, creating an impression of intentional composition rather than random marking. Archaeologically, the Cochno Stone is generally dated to the Bronze Age, approximately between 3000 and 2000 BC, based on stylistic comparisons with other prehistoric rock art in the region. Scotland, particularly during this period, was home to communities that left behind extensive petroglyph traditions, often carved into bedrock and boulders across the landscape. These markings are part of a broader European phenomenon of prehistoric rock art, found in various forms from Iberia to Scandinavia. And yet, the Cochno Stone stands out for both its scale and its complexity. The surface contains dozens of motifs, some simple and isolated, others densely clustered and interconnected. Among them are the so-called cup and ring marks, circular depressions surrounded by concentric rings carved into the stone. These designs are among the most widely recognized forms of prehistoric rock art in Atlantic Europe, yet their meaning remains unresolved. Mainstream archaeological interpretations approach these carvings with caution. The most widely accepted view is that they likely held symbolic or ritual significance. Some researchers suggest they may have been territorial markers, astronomical references, or representations of cosmological beliefs. Others propose that they functioned within ritual landscapes, forming part of broader ceremonial networks that connected natural features, settlements, and ancestral sites. However, no definitive interpretation has been universally accepted. One of the challenges in understanding the Cochno Stone lies in the absence of written context. Unlike later historical periods where inscriptions can be compared with known languages, Bronze Age rock art exists in a pre-literate framework, meaning if it was structured in a communicative sense, must be inferred indirectly through pattern analysis, spatial distribution, and comparison with other sites. Over time, the stone itself has undergone cycles of exposure and concealment. Historical records indicate that at various points it was buried intentionally to protect it from damage, then later re-exposed for study. This repeated covering and uncovering has added another layer to its history, not just of ancient use, but of modern interpretation and preservation. Yet even under controlled study, the carvings resist easy explanation. Some of the patterns appear to align with natural topographical features in the surrounding landscape. Others seem to cluster in ways that suggest intentional grouping or hierarchy. The repetition of circular motifs raises questions about whether they represent counting systems, symbolic markers, or something more abstract, perhaps visual expressions of concepts that do not translate directly into modern categories. In more speculative interpretations, the Cochno Stone has occasionally been linked to ideas of prehistoric mapping systems or encoded knowledge of the landscape. Some suggest that the patterns could represent schematic representations of routes, water sources, or celestial movements. These ideas, however, remain outside mainstream archaeology, as there is no direct evidence linking the carvings to such structured functions. Still, the density and arrangement of the motifs continue to invite questions. Why invest such sustained effort into carving a single surface with such complexity? Was the stone meant to be read in a specific way, perhaps through ritual engagement or seasonal observation? Or was it part of a broader cultural language of symbols that has since been lost, leaving only fragments of its visual vocabulary behind? The material itself, sandstone, adds another dimension to its interpretation. Softer than granite but still durable, it allows for detailed carving while remaining vulnerable to erosion over millennia. This means that what is visible today may only be a partial record of its original appearance. Some markings may have faded, while others may have been altered by natural processes or human intervention over time. Despite these uncertainties, the Cochno Stone remains one of the most significant examples of prehistoric rock art in Scotland. Its preservation, documentation, and partial excavation have provided valuable insights into Bronze Age symbolic expression, even if its full meaning remains beyond reach. And yet, meaning itself becomes a shifting concept when dealing with such ancient material. What appears abstract today may once have been immediately recognizable within a shared cultural framework. What seems like a pattern may have been a narrative. What looks like repetition may have carried layered significance understood only within a now lost tradition of interpretation. Modern archaeology can describe, classify, and compare, but it cannot always translate. As the wind moves across the hills of West Dunbartonshire and light shifts over the carved surface of the Cochno Stone, the markings remain quietly present, neither fully explained nor entirely obscure. They occupy a space between observation and interpretation, between what is physically recorded and what is culturally understood. And so the question endures, etched as deeply into scholarly reflection as the carvings are into stone itself. When a pattern survives for thousands of years without its original meaning, does it still speak? And if so, what language are we truly trying to hear? From the weathered spirals of the Cochno Stone, where prehistoric symbols fade into the damp earth of Scotland's low hills, the journey of inquiry moves once again across continents. The landscape shifts dramatically. Stone gives way to altitude, and the cool Atlantic air is replaced by the thin, crisp atmosphere of the Andes, where ancient cultures once shaped stone into forms that still challenge modern interpretation. In the high plateau region of Bolivia, not far from the archaeological heartland surrounding Lake Titicaca, lies one of the lesser-known but deeply intriguing artifacts of pre-Columbian South America, the Pokotia Monolith. At first glance, the monolith appears as a standing stone figure, carved from andesite or similar volcanic rock. It depicts a human-like form, upright and symmetrical, with stylized facial features and a composed, almost ceremonial posture. The surface of the stone is weathered, softened by time and exposure, yet the carving remains clearly intentional. Arms, torso, and facial structure are still discernible, suggesting a deliberate effort to represent a figure of significance rather than a purely abstract form. The Pokotia monolith is generally associated with the broader cultural sphere of Tiwanaku, one of the most important pre-Inca civilizations of the Andes. Tiwanaku is known for its monumental stone architecture, precise masonry, and complex ceremonial structures, many of which demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of engineering and cosmology. Within this context, carved stone figures like the Pokotia Monolith are typically interpreted as representations of deities, ancestors, or symbolic figures tied to ritual practice. Mainstream archaeological interpretation places the monolith within this ceremonial and cultural framework. It is seen as part of a sculptural tradition that emphasized human-like forms, often stylized to reflect spiritual or ideological concepts rather than realistic portraiture. The figure may have served a ritual function, possibly positioned within a temple complex or sacred space where it contributed to religious or ceremonial activity. Yet, as with many artifacts from this region and period, interpretation is not always straightforward. One of the most discussed features of the Pokotia monolith is not its form alone, but the presence of faint markings or inscriptions on its surface. These incisions appear along the body of the figure, arranged in linear sequences that some researchers have attempted to analyze as symbolic or proto-writing elements. The markings are subtle, and their interpretation depends heavily on lighting, preservation condition, and analytical method. Within academic archaeology, these inscriptions are generally approached with caution. While they are acknowledged as deliberate carvings, there is no consensus that they constitute a formal writing system. Instead, they may represent decorative motifs, ritual markings, or symbolic identifiers embedded within a broader artistic tradition. The challenge lies in distinguishing between symbolic expression and structured communication. In the Andes, systems such as the Khipu demonstrate that complex information could be encoded without alphabetic writing. This opens interpretive space for understanding how societies in the region may have recorded meaning in non-textual ways. However, whether the markings on the Pokotia monolith belong to such a system remains unverified. Still, the presence of these incisions invites further reflection. Some alternative interpretations suggest that the markings could represent a lost symbolic code, perhaps related to calendrical systems, ritual sequences, or lineage records. Others propose that they might reflect a transitional stage in the development of symbolic communication in the region, though no broader corpus of similar inscriptions has been conclusively identified to support this idea. More speculative narratives extend further, suggesting that the monolith may encode information that has yet to be fully understood or decoded. These interpretations remain outside mainstream academic consensus, but they persist in part because the object itself occupies a space between sculpture and inscription, between image and potential language. The material context also plays an important role in its interpretation. Carved from durable volcanic stone, the monolith was designed to endure. Unlike organic materials that decay over time, stone preserves both form and surface detail across centuries. Yet even stone is not immune to erosion. Wind, temperature fluctuations, and human contact over extended periods can soften edges and obscure finer details. What is visible today may therefore represent only a partial version of its original state. In the broader archaeological landscape of Tiwanaku, stone figures like the Pokotia monolith are not isolated phenomena. They exist alongside architectural complexes, ceremonial platforms, and other sculptural works that together form a cohesive cultural expression. This wider context supports interpretations that emphasize ritual and symbolic meaning rather than isolated cryptic encoding. And yet, even within this framework, questions remain. Why are certain markings present only on specific figures? Were they applied during the original carving, or added at a later stage of use or veneration? Do they represent individual identity, collective symbolism, or something entirely different that no longer fits modern categories of interpretation? The absence of definitive answers does not diminish the significance of the monolith. Instead, It highlights the limits of reconstruction when cultural systems are partially lost to time. Without written explanation or continuous tradition, interpretation becomes an exercise in careful inference rather than direct translation. Standing within this ambiguity, the Pokotia Monolith becomes more than a carved figure. It becomes a point of contact between visible form and invisible meaning, between what can be measured and what can only be inferred. And so, as the high plains of the Andes stretch outward once again near Lake Titicaca, the stone figure remains quietly present, neither fully understood nor entirely obscure. The question it leaves behind is not only about what it represents, but how meaning itself survives across time. When symbols are carved into stone but their original context fades, do they still speak clearly? Or are we only hearing echoes shaped by the limits of our own interpretation? From the carved presence of the Pokotia monolith, where human form is rendered in stone with quiet ceremonial stillness, the narrative moves once again across the vast Andean expanse. The altitude remains extreme, the air still thin, but the setting begins to shift from monumental stone sculpture towards something far smaller, more intricate, and far more enigmatic in its implications. Far to the north, in the highlands of Colombia near the region of Tolima, a series of small golden objects entered modern archaeological discourse in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These artifacts, now commonly referred to as the Tolima Golden Flyers, are part of the broader gold-working tradition associated with pre-Columbian cultures of the region, often linked to the Quimbaya and surrounding societies. At first glance, they are striking not for their size, but for their form. Each object is small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, cast in gold alloy with a warm, enduring sheen. Their surfaces are smooth yet detailed, shaped into stylized figures that appear to combine elements of animals, insects, and abstract geometric form. Some resemble birds with elongated wings. Others evoke more ambiguous shapes, symmetrical bodies with pronounced angular extensions, almost aerodynamic in appearance. It is this visual ambiguity that has drawn sustained attention beyond traditional archaeological interpretation. In established academic contexts, these objects are generally understood as ritual or ceremonial artifacts. Gold in pre-Columbian societies of the Andes and northern South America was not merely decorative, it held deep symbolic and spiritual significance. It was associated with solar imagery, divine authority, and elite status. The Tolima figures are therefore often interpreted as representations of spiritual beings, zoomorphic symbols, or ceremonial objects used in ritual contexts. Many of these artifacts were recovered during the colonial and post-colonial periods, often through looting or informal excavation, which complicates their archaeological context. Without precise excavation records or stratigraphic documentation, it becomes difficult to assign exact cultural attribution or function with certainty. As a result, interpretations rely heavily on stylistic comparison and metallurgical analysis. However, the unusual shape of some of these figures has generated alternative interpretations over time. The angular wings, symmetrical bodies, and streamlined forms of certain specimens have led some observers to draw comparisons with modern aircraft or aerodynamic structures. This visual resemblance has fueled speculative theories, suggesting that the objects may represent stylized depictions of flying machines, symbolic representations of flight, or even knowledge of mechanical principles beyond their historical period. These interpretations remain outside mainstream archaeology and are not supported by empirical evidence. No material analysis indicates functional mechanical design, and no contextual archaeological data suggests technological intent. Instead, metallurgical studies indicate that the objects were created using lost wax casting techniques, a sophisticated but well-documented method used extensively in pre-Columbian gold-working traditions. Still, the persistence of these alternative interpretations highlights an important aspect of archaeological perception: the human tendency to interpret unfamiliar forms through the lens of contemporary experience. When viewed without cultural context, abstract or symbolic forms can appear to resemble modern objects. In the case of the Tolima figures, the aerodynamic impression is compelling to some viewers precisely because it is abstract enough to invite comparison, yet structured enough to suggest intention. Within academic interpretation, however, these similarities are understood as coincidental rather than functional. The emphasis remains on symbolic meaning rather than literal representation. In many indigenous cultures of the region, hybrid animal forms were common in artistic expression, often representing mythological beings or spiritual intermediaries between natural and supernatural realms. In this framework, the Tolima golden flyers may be better understood not as depictions of machines or physical objects, but as symbolic entities, visual expressions of concepts that do not translate directly into modern technological categories. And yet, even within this interpretive framework, questions remain. Why do certain forms recur across different artifacts in similar stylistic variations? What symbolic system governed the transformation of natural and animal forms into abstract geometric structures? And how much of this visual language is still accessible through surviving material culture, given that much of it was lost during colonial disruption and the passage of time? The broader cultural context of Tolima and surrounding regions reveals a rich tradition of gold working, where metallurgy was not only a technical practice, but also a medium of cosmological expression. Gold artifacts were often placed in ceremonial offerings, buried in ritual deposits, or used in elite funerary contexts, suggesting that their function extended far beyond aesthetic display. Within this worldview, transformation itself was a central theme. Humans, animals, and spiritual beings could shift forms, existing in fluid relationships rather than fixed categories. Viewed through this lens, the hybrid appearance of the Tolima figures aligns more closely with mythological symbolism than with literal representation. Yet interpretation remains layered. Because many of these objects were removed from their original archaeological contexts before systematic study, modern understanding is inherently fragmented. Each artifact becomes a partial narrative, complete in form but incomplete in context. What remains is a visual object suspended between cultural meaning and modern speculation. In scientific study, the emphasis remains on craftsmanship, alloy composition, and manufacturing technique. Analyses show advanced metallurgical skill consistent with known pre-Columbian gold-working traditions, but no indication of mechanical function or technological design beyond ritual artistry. Still, the tension between appearance and interpretation continues to generate interest. It raises a broader question about how meaning is assigned to objects across time. When cultural context is lost, does form alone carry enough information to reconstruct intent? Or does interpretation inevitably reflect the observer more than the originator? The Tolima golden flyers remain then, as they have for centuries. Small, luminous forms shaped in gold, reflecting light in ways that shift depending on perspective. They exist at the intersection of art, ritual, and interpretation, anchored in ancient craftsmanship, yet continually reimagined through modern curiosity. And as the narrative moves beyond the highlands of Tolima, one final question lingers quietly beneath the surface. When an object can be seen as both symbol and structure, where does meaning truly reside? In the artifact itself, or in the eyes that continue to reinterpret it across time? From the shimmering gold forms of the Tolima golden flyers, where small, enigmatic figures seem to hover between symbolism and interpretation, the narrative continues deeper into the same cultural horizon, yet shifts toward a broader and more complex archaeological tradition. The setting remains the northern Andes of South America, where rivers cut through dense valleys and ancient societies once shaped one of the most sophisticated metallurgical traditions in the pre-Columbian world. In the region of modern-day Colombia known as Quindío and surrounding areas once inhabited by the Quimbaya civilization, archaeologists and collectors have encountered a remarkable range of gold artifacts collectively referred to as Quimbaya Artifacts. These objects are not isolated curiosities. They represent an entire artistic and technological tradition that flourished long before European contact, between roughly 500 BC and 1600 AD, though many of the most famous pieces are difficult to precisely date due to the circumstances of their discovery and acquisition. At first glance, Quimbaya artifacts immediately draw attention for their material. Gold alloyed with copper in carefully controlled proportions, producing a warm, reddish tone distinct from pure gold. The objects range from finely detailed human figurines to ceremonial vessels, ornaments, and ritual offerings. Some are small and delicate, designed to be worn or carried. Others are more substantial, intended for ceremonial use or burial contexts. The craftsmanship is striking. Smooth surfaces, symmetrical forms, and intricate detailing suggest a highly developed understanding of both metallurgy and artistic expression. The lost wax casting technique, widely used in the region, allowed artisans to create complex hollow forms with remarkable precision. This method required not only technical skill, but also careful planning, as each piece had to be modeled in wax before being encased in clay and cast in molten metal. In the broader archaeological record, Quimbaya goldwork is often associated with elite social structures and ritual practices. Gold was not used as currency in the modern sense, but as a material deeply embedded in cosmological and symbolic systems. It was associated with solar imagery, transformation, fertility, and spiritual power. Objects made of gold were frequently placed in tombs, used in ceremonies, or offered as part of sacred rituals. One of the most famous assemblages associated with this tradition is the so-called Quimbaya treasure, a collection of gold objects discovered in the late 19th century and later dispersed into museum collections. These artifacts include pauperos, lime containers used in ritual chewing of coca leaves, anthropomorphic figures, and ornately decorated vessels. Many of these pieces are now housed in institutions such as the Museo del Oro in Bogotá, where they remain central to the study of pre-Columbian metallurgy. Yet, despite extensive study, interpretation is not always straightforward. The human figures depicted in Quimbaya goldwork are often highly stylized. Bodies are simplified into geometric forms, with exaggerated proportions and minimal facial detail. Some figures appear seated in formal postures, while others seem to represent transformation or hybrid states between human and animal forms. This stylization has led to multiple layers of interpretation regarding their meaning. Mainstream archaeology generally understands these figures as symbolic representations tied to ritual, status, or mythology. They may depict ancestors, spiritual beings, or participants in ceremonial activities. In many indigenous cosmologies of the Andes and surrounding regions, the boundary between human, animal, and spiritual identity is fluid, allowing for artistic expressions that blend multiple forms into a single figure. Within this framework, Quimbaya artifacts are not literal portraits, but visual expressions of worldview, material reflections of beliefs about transformation, duality, and the structure of the cosmos. However, the complexity of certain designs has also led to broader speculation outside academic consensus. Some observers have noted that certain Quimbaya figures, particularly those with symmetrical wing-like extensions or structured body forms, appear highly abstract when removed from cultural context. These interpretations sometimes suggest comparisons to mechanical forms or engineered structures. Such ideas, while visually intriguing to some modern viewers, are not supported by archaeological evidence or metallurgical analysis. Scientific studies consistently show that these objects were created using advanced but well-understood pre-Columbian casting techniques. No structural evidence indicates functional mechanical design, and no contextual data suggests technological intent beyond ritual or symbolic use. Still, the visual ambiguity of abstraction continues to shape perception. This is not unique to Quimbaya artifacts. Across many ancient cultures, stylization often reaches levels where modern viewers struggle to immediately identify reference. Without cultural framing, symbolic forms can appear unfamiliar, even alien. The human mind naturally seeks patterns, sometimes projecting contemporary concepts onto ancient designs. In the case of Quimbaya goldwork, this tension between interpretation and intent becomes especially pronounced because of the precision and refinement of the objects themselves. The craftsmanship suggests intentionality at every level, from alloy composition to surface finish. Yet the meaning behind that intentionality remains partially inaccessible. Another layer of complexity arises from the historical circumstances of discovery. Many Quimbaya artifacts entered collections during the colonial and post-colonial periods, often through looting, private excavation, or undocumented recovery. As a result, much of the original archaeological context, the exact burial conditions, associated materials, and spatial relationships, was lost. Without this context, archaeologists must rely on typology, comparison, and material analysis to reconstruct cultural meaning. This loss of context does not diminish the artifact's significance, but it does limit the precision of interpretation. Within controlled archaeological excavations in the broader region of Quindío, similar objects have been found in funerary settings, reinforcing the connection between goldwork and ritual burial practices. These findings support the interpretation that such objects were deeply embedded in beliefs about death, transformation, and the continuation of identity beyond physical life. Yet, even with this understanding, many questions remain open. Why did certain forms recur across different regions and time periods? What symbolic logic governed the transformation of human and animal figures into geometric abstraction? And how much of this visual language was shared across communities versus localized to specific cultural groups within the broader Quimbaya sphere? The Quimbaya artifacts therefore exist not as isolated objects, but as fragments of a larger symbolic system, one that is partially preserved in metal but largely absent in written explanation. And so interpretation becomes an act of reconstruction across silence. Modern research continues to analyze composition, manufacturing technique, and stylistic variation, gradually refining understanding of technological sophistication. Yet meaning itself, what these objects represented to the people who made and used them, remains partially beyond reach. Gold, in this context, was never just material. It was a medium through which relationships between humans, nature, and the cosmos were expressed. Light, transformation, and permanence were not abstract concepts, but embodied qualities shaped into physical form. Still, even with this framework, each artifact retains a degree of mystery. When held in museum collections today, under controlled lighting and careful preservation, they appear both familiar and distant, objects that clearly belong to human hands, yet resist complete narrative resolution. And as the broader exploration continues beyond the valleys of Quindío, one final reflection emerges quietly. When a civilization expresses its worldview through material beauty rather than written explanation, how much of its meaning survives the passage of time, and how much remains permanently suspended between what was created and what can still be understood? From the refined gold forms of the Quimbaya artifacts, where symbolic meaning is cast into metal with extraordinary precision, the narrative shifts across oceans and hemispheres. The humid forests of South America fade into memory, replaced by the cold Atlantic winds of northeastern North America, where rock meets tide and time is written not in gold or clay, but in stone worn by centuries of salt and wind. On the banks of the Taunton River in Massachusetts, near the coastal region of Berkeley, lies a large, slanted slab of rock partially submerged in the riverbed. This is Dighton rock, a boulder that has fascinated observers for over 3 centuries due to the dense and complex markings carved into its surface. At low tide, the stone reveals itself more fully, a broad, flat face covered in overlapping inscriptions, petroglyphs, and abstract carvings. Lines intersect, curves spiral, and clustered symbols appear etched into the rock in layers, as if multiple hands, or multiple eras, contributed to its surface over time. Unlike many isolated rock carvings, Dighton rock is notable for the sheer density of its markings. The surface is not dominated by a single motif, but by a chaotic convergence of forms that seem to accumulate rather than replace one another. This has made interpretation particularly challenging, as distinguishing original carvings from later additions or natural erosion patterns is difficult even under modern analysis. The earliest recorded European observations of the rock date back to the late 17th century. At that time, the inscriptions were already present, and their origin was unknown. Over the centuries, scholars, antiquarians, and enthusiasts have proposed a wide range of interpretations, some grounded in archaeology, others extending into speculation and legend. Mainstream archaeological understanding classifies the markings as indigenous petroglyphs, likely created by native peoples of the northeastern region of North America. The exact cultural attribution remains uncertain, as multiple indigenous groups historically inhabited or traversed the area, and stylistic comparisons alone cannot definitively assign authorship. In this interpretation, the carvings are understood as symbolic expressions, possibly related to territorial markers, ritual activity, or narrative representation. The overlapping nature of the inscriptions may reflect repeated use of the site over extended periods, with successive generations adding their own symbolic contributions to an already significant location. However, the complexity of the markings has led to a long history of alternative theories. In the 18th and 19th centuries, some scholars and explorers proposed that the inscriptions might be evidence of pre-Columbian transoceanic contact. Various interpretations suggested possible connections to Norse explorers, Phoenician travelers, or even early European voyagers predating Columbus. These theories were often influenced by limited archaeological knowledge of the time and a broader tendency to attribute complex or unfamiliar artifacts to external civilizations. Over time, these interpretations were largely reevaluated as archaeological methodology advanced. Comparative studies of indigenous rock art in the region demonstrated stylistic and contextual parallels that support native authorship. Nevertheless, the earlier theories remain part of the historical narrative surrounding the site, reflecting how interpretation evolves alongside scientific understanding. The challenge with Dighton rock lies not only in its imagery, but in its erosion history. The stone has been submerged, exposed, relocated, and even displayed in museums before being returned to its original environment. Each phase of exposure has altered how the carvings are perceived. Water erosion has softened edges, while human handling and documentation have introduced additional layers of interpretation through sketches, casts, and reproductions. In the early 20th century, the rock was moved to a museum for preservation, where it was studied under controlled conditions. Later, it was returned to a protected site, now housed within a small shelter near its original location in Berkeley. Despite these efforts, the surface continues to change subtly over time, shaped by environmental exposure and the passage of centuries. One of the most intriguing aspects of Dighton rock is the difficulty in distinguishing intentional carvings from natural surface patterns. The rock's composition and exposure to tidal conditions have created fractures and textures that can resemble deliberate markings. This has led to ongoing debates regarding which elements are human-made and which are the result of natural geological processes. Even among confirmed carvings, interpretation is not straightforward. Some symbols appear geometric, others more figurative. Certain arrangements suggest repetition or sequencing, while others appear isolated or fragmented. Without a decipherable system or accompanying cultural reference, the markings resist translation into a coherent narrative. This ambiguity has allowed the rock to become a kind of interpretive canvas across centuries. Antiquarians once attempted detailed tracings of the inscriptions, producing drawings that often differed significantly from one another. These variations highlight the subjective nature of interpretation when dealing with complex, eroded surfaces. What one observer records as a clear symbol, another may interpret as an overlapping fracture or natural mark. Modern archaeological consensus emphasizes caution. While the rock is widely recognized as a significant indigenous cultural site, the lack of definitive contextual information prevents precise interpretation of its symbolic content. Instead, it is studied as part of a broader tradition of northeastern North American rock art, which includes a wide variety of motifs whose meanings are not always recoverable. And yet, despite scholarly caution, Dighton rock continues to attract curiosity. Part of this enduring fascination lies in its visual density. The accumulation of markings across its surface creates an impression of layered communication, messages written, overwritten, and partially erased by time. It feels less like a single inscription and more like a conversation stretched across generations, now fragmented and incomplete. But without the voices that created it, that conversation remains silent. The rock stands today within its protective enclosure near the Taunton River, its surface visible but its meaning unresolved. Water rises and falls with the tides, light shifts across the carved stone, and visitors pause to observe patterns that resist easy explanation. And so the question remains, not as a puzzle awaiting solution, but as a reflection on the limits of interpretation itself. When symbols endure long after the cultures that created them have changed or faded, are we truly seeing their meaning? Or only the outlines left behind by time, waiting for a language we no longer fully possess? From the tide-worn surface of Dighton rock, where layered markings blur the boundary between inscription and erosion, the narrative shifts once again across oceans and hemispheres. The Atlantic fog dissolves into the heat of the southern sky, where rugged terrain replaces coastal stone and the landscape rises into ancient volcanic formations shaped by time, pressure, and fire. In the highlands of northeastern South Africa, near the borders of what is today Mpumalanga, lies a rocky outcrop that appears at first to be part of the natural terrain. It sits quietly among rolling grasslands and scattered stone formations, seemingly unremarkable until viewed more closely. This site is known as Adam's Calendar. What distinguishes it from the surrounding landscape is not immediately obvious from a distance, but upon closer inspection, the formation reveals a striking arrangement. Upright stone pillars, some weathered and partially collapsed, aligned in a circular configuration that suggests intentional placement. Nearby, additional stones extend outward in patterns that have led some observers to propose astronomical alignments or calendrical functions. At ground level, the site feels subtle, almost indistinguishable from natural rock formations scattered across the region. But from certain vantage points, especially when considering the arrangement of the stones as a whole, patterns begin to emerge. Patterns that raise questions about whether this arrangement is purely geological or whether it reflects deliberate human modification. Mainstream archaeological interpretation remains cautious. The dominant view is that Adam's Calendar is likely the result of a combination of natural geological processes and later human activity, possibly from Iron Age or later pastoral communities in the region. South Africa has a long history of human occupation, with archaeological evidence showing continuous habitation and landscape modification over thousands of years. Stone arrangements, cattle enclosures, and ritual spaces are not uncommon in various parts of southern Africa. Within this framework, the stones at Adam's calendar may represent a modified natural formation or a later cultural site whose original function has not been fully preserved in the archaeological record. However, alternative interpretations have circulated widely, particularly in non-academic literature. Some researchers and independent investigators have proposed that the site may be significantly older than mainstream estimates suggest. These interpretations argue that the arrangement of stones exhibits intentional geometric organization that could suggest advanced astronomical or calendrical knowledge. According to these views, the positioning of certain stones relative to the sun and horizon may indicate solstitial or seasonal alignment functions. These ideas remain highly debated and are not supported by consensus archaeological evidence. No definitive excavation report has confirmed a precise construction date for the full arrangement, and the complexity of distinguishing natural basalt formations from modified structures in the region adds further uncertainty. Yet the visual impression of intentional design persists for some observers. The circular arrangement, the upright positioning of certain stones, and the apparent alignment with natural features of the surrounding landscape all contribute to interpretations that extend beyond purely geological explanations. In particular, the presence of a central stone formation that appears more structured than surrounding rock has been a focal point of discussion. Still, interpretation remains deeply dependent on perspective. Geologically, the region is composed of ancient volcanic rock, shaped over millions of years through tectonic activity, erosion, and weathering. Natural processes can create vertical fractures and upright formations that resemble intentionally placed stones. Over time, erosion can further isolate and expose such formations, enhancing their appearance as constructed features. Archaeologically, distinguishing between naturally occurring formations and human modification often requires excavation, stratigraphic analysis, and material dating, tools that have been applied only in limited ways at the site. As a result, much of the discussion surrounding Adam's calendar exists at the intersection of observation and interpretation, where visual structure alone is not sufficient to establish definitive origin. In some alternative narratives, the site has been described as one of the oldest stone calendars in the world, with claims suggesting extremely ancient origins far beyond established timelines of complex civilization in southern Africa. These interpretations often connect the site to broader speculative theories about prehistoric knowledge systems or lost cultural traditions. However, such claims are not supported by peer-reviewed archaeological evidence, and they remain outside mainstream academic consensus. What remains consistent across all perspectives is the recognition that the site does exhibit a structured arrangement of stones that invites inquiry. Whether that structure is the result of natural processes later modified by humans or entirely shaped by cultural activity is still a matter of ongoing discussion. The surrounding landscape adds to the ambiguity. The region near Mpumalanga is characterized by ancient geological formations, rolling grasslands, and weathered rock outcrops that can easily obscure the distinction between natural and modified features. Seasonal changes in vegetation further alter visibility, meaning that what appears clearly structured in one season may blend into the terrain in another. This dynamic environment complicates long-term interpretation. Over time, vegetation growth, erosion, and human interaction may have altered the site's appearance, further blurring its original configuration. Without a clearly documented excavation history, reconstructing its earliest state becomes increasingly challenging. And yet, despite these uncertainties, Adam's calendar continues to attract attention. It sits quietly within the landscape, neither fully explained nor entirely mysterious in isolation, but positioned at a threshold where geology, archaeology, and interpretation intersect. Its stones do not speak in inscriptions or imagery, but in arrangement and presence, offering structure without explicit explanation. And so the question remains, suspended in the still air of the South African highlands. When a formation appears ordered within an ancient landscape shaped by both natural forces and human history, where does interpretation end? And where does certainty truly begin? Even as interpretations of Adam's calendar continue to diverge, the formation itself remains fixed in place, shaped by time but unchanged in its essential physical presence. The debate unfolds around it, while the stones remain indifferent to the narratives imposed upon them. This contrast between permanence and interpretation is central to many archaeological landscapes, where the material record survives, but the cultural framework that once gave it meaning is partially or entirely lost. In regions such as northeastern South Africa, long sequences of human occupation and environmental change have produced layers of interaction between people and landscape, making it difficult to isolate a single moment of origin for any given structure. Within this context, Adam's calendar exists as part of a broader continuum of stone usage, modification, and natural formation that spans thousands of years, rather than a clearly defined, isolated construction event. Geological processes in the region further complicate interpretation. Volcanic rock, fracturing, erosion, and weathering can create arrangements that appear deliberate, especially when viewed from specific angles or under certain lighting conditions. At the same time, human activity across prehistoric and historic periods in southern Africa demonstrates a long tradition of engaging with stone landscapes for practical, symbolic, and spatial purposes, leaving open multiple interpretive pathways. The challenge lies in distinguishing between coincidence of formation and intentional arrangement, a distinction that often requires excavation evidence that is limited or absent at this particular site. As a result, much of the discussion depends on surface observation, comparative analysis, and theoretical modeling rather than direct stratigraphic confirmation. This reliance on indirect interpretation naturally produces a wide spectrum of conclusions, ranging from strictly geological explanations to more expansive cultural hypotheses, each reflecting different methodological assumptions. Yet none of these interpretations fully resolves the ambiguity embedded in the site's physical structure, which continues to resist singular classification. The circular layout and upright stones remain visually suggestive, but suggestion alone does not establish chronology or function without supporting archaeological data. Over time, environmental change has likely altered the visibility and configuration of the site, further complicating efforts to reconstruct its earliest form with precision. This dynamic relationship between landscape and perception means that what is seen today may not fully represent what once existed, nor can it be easily disentangled from natural processes. In this sense, Adam's calendar becomes less a fixed answer and more an evolving point of reference within broader discussions of human interaction with ancient landscapes. And so, as the highland winds move quietly across Adam's calendar, the formation remains in place, neither fully decoded nor fully explained, leaving open the enduring question of whether its order is a message from human intention or simply another expression of deep geological time interpreted through human eyes. From the weathered stone formations of Adam's calendar, where questions of natural structure and human intent still quietly coexist, the narrative shifts once again across continents. The heat of the southern hemisphere fades into the temperate stillness of central France, where rolling fields, forest edges, and quiet rural landscapes conceal one of the most controversial archaeological discoveries of the modern era. In the early 20th century, near the small village of Glozel, a farmer working the land reportedly uncovered unusual objects buried beneath the soil. What began as an unremarkable excavation of farmland soon became the center of one of archaeology's most enduring debates. Among the finds were fired clay tablets, engraved stones, bone objects, and ceramic fragments, collectively now known as the Glozel Tablets. At first glance, the tablets appear modest, small, irregularly shaped pieces of clay, hardened by fire, their surfaces marked with incised symbols. Lines, grids, abstract forms, and repetitive patterns cover many of the objects. Some appear carefully arranged, almost structured like writing systems. Others are more fragmented, as if representing incomplete or evolving forms of expression. But from the moment of their discovery, the Glozel finds were surrounded by controversy. Unlike many archaeological sites that are gradually studied, cataloged, and contextualized over time, Glozel entered public awareness in a state of immediate dispute. Questions were raised not only about the meaning of the artifacts, but about their authenticity, stratigraphy, and archaeological context. Early examinations produced conflicting conclusions. Some researchers suggested that the artifacts could represent a previously unknown prehistoric writing system in Western Europe. If authentic and ancient, the inscriptions would imply a level of symbolic communication far earlier and more geographically widespread than traditionally accepted models of European prehistory suggest. This interpretation, however, was immediately met with skepticism from other scholars. One of the central issues was context. Archaeology relies not only on objects themselves, but on their stratigraphic position, the layers of soil and material in which they are found. At Glozel, disagreements arose regarding the integrity of the excavation layers and whether the artifacts were genuinely ancient or potentially introduced into the site under uncertain circumstances. As a result, the site became one of the most debated archaeological discoveries in France during the 20th century. Mainstream archaeological consensus today tends to view the Glozel artifacts with caution. Many researchers consider them to be either modern creations or objects whose archaeological context cannot be reliably established. The lack of consistent stratigraphic documentation and the controversies surrounding the early excavation methods have contributed to ongoing uncertainty. Yet despite this caution, the artifacts themselves continue to invite examination. The inscriptions on the Glozel tablets are not random. They display repetition, alignment, and variation in form that suggest deliberate construction. Some sequences resemble early forms of symbolic notation, while others appear more abstract, resisting straightforward categorization. This tension, between apparent structure and uncertain origin, lies at the heart of the Glozel debate. If the markings are intentional, what system of meaning do they represent? If they are not part of a coherent writing system, what purpose did they serve? In archaeology, the distinction between decoration, symbolism, and writing is often subtle. Many early cultures used symbols long before the development of formal writing systems. These symbols could represent ownership, ritual significance, numerical concepts, or social identity. Without a decipherable linguistic framework, interpretation becomes inherently limited. At Glozel, this limitation is especially pronounced. Some early supporters of the artifact's authenticity proposed that the tablets could represent a transitional stage in the development of writing in Western Europe. In this view, the site might preserve an early symbolic system that did not evolve into a widely used script and therefore left no descendants in later historical records. Others suggested that the markings could be part of a ritual or magical system of symbols, used not for communication in a linguistic sense, but for spiritual or ceremonial purposes. In many ancient societies, symbols were believed to carry intrinsic power, independent of spoken language. Under this interpretation, the tablets might not be read in the modern sense at all, but instead functioned as objects of ritual significance. However, these interpretations remain speculative. The absence of a broader corpus of similar inscriptions from securely dated contexts makes it difficult to situate Glozel within a wider cultural or historical framework. In archaeology, isolated discoveries, no matter how intriguing, are difficult to interpret without comparative material. This is one of the reasons why Glozel remains so controversial. It sits at the intersection of possibility and uncertainty, where evidence exists, but its meaning is not agreed upon. The physical nature of the artifacts adds another layer to this complexity. The clay tablets were fired, a process that requires controlled heating. This indicates deliberate human production rather than accidental formation. The firing process also suggests intention, as unfired clay would not preserve inscriptions in the same way. Yet firing alone does not establish antiquity or cultural attribution. Radiometric dating and thermoluminescence studies have been conducted on some objects from the site, producing a range of results that have been interpreted differently by various researchers. Some results appear consistent with ancient origins, while others have been questioned due to potential contamination or methodological limitations. The lack of unanimous agreement has prevented a definitive resolution. Meanwhile, the surrounding region of Glozel offers its own archaeological richness. Central France contains numerous prehistoric sites spanning Paleolithic, Neolithic, and later periods, with well-documented evidence of human habitation, symbolic expression, and early technological development. This broader context makes the possibility of ancient symbolic systems in the region plausible in general terms, even if the specific case of Glozel remains unresolved. And yet, it is precisely this unresolved status that sustains interest. Unlike well-integrated archaeological discoveries that fit neatly into established timelines, Glozel resists easy placement. It neither fully confirms nor entirely disappears within the framework of European prehistory. Instead, it remains suspended between interpretations: archaeological, historical, and skeptical. Over time, the debate itself has become part of the site's identity. Publications, critiques, reanalyses, and counter-analyses have layered additional meaning onto the artifacts, turning them into subjects not only of archaeological inquiry, but also of methodological reflection. What counts as evidence? How is authenticity established? And how does interpretation change when consensus cannot be reached? These questions extend beyond Glozel itself. They touch on the broader nature of archaeology as a discipline, one that reconstructs the past through fragments, often incomplete, sometimes ambiguous, always dependent on context that may no longer fully exist. The Glozel Tablets therefore occupy a unique position. They are physical objects with observable characteristics, yet their meaning remains contested. They exist simultaneously as artifacts, hypotheses, and debates. And so the site endures not as a resolved chapter of history, but as an open inquiry. In the quiet fields near Glozel, where the earth once yielded its controversial finds, the landscape offers no answers of its own. The soil is still, the horizon unchanged. But beneath that stillness lies a question that continues to echo through archaeological discussion. When an object appears to carry the structure of meaning, but its origin cannot be securely placed in time or culture, do we interpret what is truly there, or only what our frameworks allow us to see? Even as scholarly debate continues around Glozel tablets, the objects themselves remain physically unchanged, yet conceptually unstable. Their presence anchors the discussion, while their meaning drifts between competing interpretations that rarely settle into consensus. This duality is not unusual in archaeology, where material evidence often survives without the full chain of cultural context that once gave it clarity. What remains is form without certainty, structure without an agreed narrative. In the case of Glozel, the uncertainty is amplified by the early history of discovery, where excavation conditions and documentation practices did not meet the standards expected in modern archaeological methodology. As a result, interpretation becomes heavily dependent on analysis of the objects themselves, rather than their stratigraphic environment. This shifts the burden of evidence from context to morphology, which is inherently more open to subjective reading. The engraved symbols continue to provoke comparison with known systems of early communication, yet no definitive linkage has been established. Similarity, in this case, remains observational rather than evidential. Over time, the debate surrounding the tablets has expanded beyond the artifacts themselves, becoming a reflection of broader questions in archaeology about how knowledge is validated and how uncertainty is managed. Some scholars emphasize caution, noting that isolated assemblages without clear provenance cannot reliably support broad historical conclusions. Others argue that even ambiguous material deserves careful consideration rather than dismissal. This tension between caution and curiosity has become part of the intellectual identity of Glozel, where the discussion often mirrors larger methodological divides within the discipline itself. The surrounding region of central France provides ample evidence of long-term human occupation, yet connecting those broader cultural sequences directly to the tablets remains speculative without definitive associative data. In this way, the artifacts occupy a liminal space, not fully integrated into established prehistoric narratives, yet not entirely excluded from consideration either. Their ambiguity ensures continued attention, not because they resolve questions, but because they sustain them. Each new analysis adds another layer, rather than removing uncertainty. The passage of time has also transformed the tablets into historical objects of debate as much as physical artifacts, embedding them within a century-long discourse about authenticity, interpretation, and archaeological authority. As perspectives shift, so too does the meaning attributed to the same engraved surfaces, suggesting that interpretation is often as dynamic as the evidence itself. In this ongoing process, the tablets function less as answers and more as catalysts, objects that continually generate inquiry without reaching final resolution. And so, as the fields around Glozel remain quiet and unchanged, the deeper question persists. When meaning cannot be fully anchored in context, does it belong to the artifact itself, or to the evolving frameworks through which we attempt to understand it? From the contested surfaces of the Glozel Tablets, where questions of authenticity and meaning remain suspended between evidence and debate, the narrative moves once again across oceans and hemispheres. The atmosphere shifts dramatically. The cool, quiet fields of central France give way to the arid expanses of southern Peru, where wind-carved valleys and desert plateaus hold one of the most controversial and visually striking assemblages associated with ancient iconography. In the region surrounding the city of Ica, archaeologists, collectors, and independent investigators have reported the existence of thousands of engraved stones, now widely known as the Ica stones. At first glance, they are deceptively simple objects. Smooth river stones, mostly andesite, basalt, or similar volcanic material, darkened by time and polished by natural erosion. Yet upon closer inspection, their surfaces reveal intricate engravings, fine lines etched into stone depicting scenes that range from the familiar to the profoundly unexpected. Human figures appear alongside animals, plants, and complex geometric forms. Some stones show what seem to be surgical procedures. Others depict astronomical scenes. A number of the carvings show human interaction with extinct animals, while others present imagery that appears technologically complex, at least when viewed through a modern interpretive lens. The sheer variety of scenes has made the collection one of the most discussed and controversial in modern archaeological discourse. Unlike many well-documented archaeological discoveries, the Ica stones do not originate from a single controlled excavation. Instead, they entered public awareness primarily through private collections and reported discoveries in the mid-20th century. particularly associated with local collectors in the Ica region. This lack of controlled archaeological context has become one of the central points of contention in evaluating their authenticity and significance. Mainstream archaeology approaches the stones with caution. The dominant view is that many, if not all, of the engraved stones are modern creations or modified objects lacking verified antiquity. This interpretation is based largely on the absence of stratigraphic documentation, the circumstances of their discovery, and stylistic inconsistencies with known pre-Columbian artistic traditions. Without secure excavation data, it is difficult to place the stones within an established cultural or chronological framework. In archaeology, context is essential. An artifact without context is like a sentence without a known language system. It may contain structure, but its meaning cannot be reliably interpreted. However, the visual content of the stones continues to attract attention. Some engravings depict what appear to be complex scenes, figures interacting with animals, celestial arrangements, and what some observers describe as anatomical procedures or astronomical observations. Others show more abstract patterns, lines, and symbolic arrangements that resist immediate classification. It is this visual diversity that has allowed the stones to become a focal point for competing interpretations. In academic perspectives, even if some stones were created in antiquity, they are more likely to represent modern cultural productions, tourist art, or symbolic reinterpretations rather than evidence of lost ancient technological knowledge. The absence of excavation records, combined with inconsistent stylistic features, supports this cautious assessment. Yet alternative interpretations persist in popular and fringe literature. Some writers and independent researchers have suggested that the stones may represent a lost historical record, possibly encoding knowledge of astronomy, medicine, or extinct fauna. In these interpretations, the engravings are viewed not as isolated artistic expressions, but as part of a broader narrative system, one that could, in theory, preserve information about prehistoric life or forgotten cultural traditions. Among the most controversial claims are depictions that some interpret as showing interactions between humans and dinosaurs. These interpretations, however, are not supported by established paleontological or archaeological evidence. The scientific consensus places the extinction of non-avian dinosaurs at approximately 66 million years ago, while the emergence of Homo sapiens occurred much later, around 300,000 years ago. No credible evidence connects these timelines in a way that would support coexistence. Still, the presence of such imagery in the stones has fueled ongoing speculation, particularly outside academic circles. Other interpretations focus less on literal representation and more on symbolic or allegorical meaning. In this view, the scenes may not depict historical events at all, but rather mythological narratives, ritual symbolism, or cosmological concepts. Many ancient cultures used symbolic imagery to represent forces of nature, spiritual beliefs, and societal values, often in ways that do not translate directly into modern visual categories. This raises an important interpretive challenge. When does symbolic art become narrative, and when does narrative become misunderstood observation? The material itself adds another layer to the discussion. The stones are typically composed of andesite or similar volcanic rock, materials commonly found in the Andean region. Their surfaces are suitable for fine engraving, allowing for detailed incisions that can survive for long periods under favorable conditions. However, stone alone does not provide chronological certainty. Without stratified archaeological context, it is difficult to determine when or by whom the engravings were made. Some proponents of authenticity argue that natural patination or surface weathering patterns on certain stones suggest age. Others counter that such features can be artificially reproduced or may not reliably indicate antiquity without corroborating evidence. This tension between visual impression and scientific verification lies at the core of the debate. The region of Ica itself is archaeologically rich, with a long history of pre-Columbian cultures such as the Paracas and Nazca civilizations. These societies are known for their textiles, ceramics, geoglyphs, and sophisticated artistic traditions. However, the style of the engraved stones does not consistently align with established material culture from these groups, further complicating attribution. In some cases, comparisons are made between motifs on the stones and known iconography from nearby cultures. Yet such comparisons remain inconclusive, as stylistic overlap does not necessarily indicate direct cultural connection, especially when contextual data is absent. Over time, the stones have moved between private collections, museums, and public exhibitions, further complicating their study. Each relocation introduces new variables, documentation changes, provenance uncertainty, and shifts in interpretive framing. Without a stable archaeological record, the stones exist in a state of interpretive fluidity. And yet, despite all uncertainty, they continue to provoke questions. Why do so many distinct scenes exist on similar material surfaces within a single geographic region? Are they part of a coherent tradition now lost, or a collection of unrelated modern creations inspired by ancient motifs? And if some elements are modern, could others still preserve fragments of older symbolic systems? These questions remain open precisely because the evidence itself is fragmented. Within archaeological methodology, the inability to confirm context does not automatically render an object meaningless. Instead, it places it in a category where interpretation must remain cautious, conditional, and constantly subject to revision. The Ica stones therefore occupy a complex position, not fully integrated into established prehistory, but not entirely dismissed from cultural study either. They exist in a space where visual narrative is abundant, but historical certainty is limited. And so the stones remain, etched with scenes that invite interpretation but resist closure, arranged across shelves, collections, and memories of discovery that cannot always be fully reconstructed. As the desert winds move across the valleys near Ica, the engraved surfaces continue to catch light and shadow, revealing and concealing details with each shift of perspective. And the question persists, quietly embedded in stone. When images appear to tell stories without a verifiable origin, are we witnessing fragments of forgotten history, or reflections of the human desire to find meaning in what time has left unfinished? Even as the wind continues to sweep across the valleys near Ica, the stones remain unchanged in their physical form, yet endlessly shifting in interpretation. Each new generation that encounters them brings its own vocabulary, its own expectations, and its own boundaries of what ancient history is allowed to look like. This shifting lens of interpretation is not unique to the Ica stones. Across archaeology, objects without secure context often become mirrors more than messages, reflecting the intellectual frameworks of those who study them rather than the intentions of those who created them. In that sense, the stones occupy a fragile space between documentation and imagination. Their engraved surfaces remain fixed, yet the narratives built around them expand, contract, and transform depending on cultural moment and scholarly perspective. Some researchers emphasize that ambiguity itself is not a flaw in archaeological material, but a natural consequence of incomplete preservation. Time does not preserve civilizations evenly. It fragments them, leaving behind isolated pieces that resist full reconstruction. Yet ambiguity also invites projection. Where certainty is absent, interpretation becomes more flexible, and the human mind naturally seeks patterns, even where patterns may not have been intended in the modern analytical sense. This is why the stones continue to generate discussion long after their initial discovery. They exist not only as physical artifacts, but as ongoing questions about how knowledge is formed, challenged, and sometimes reshaped by uncertainty. Within the broader history of the Andes, cultures such as those associated with the Paracas and Nazca regions demonstrate that symbolic complexity was a central feature of artistic expression. However, connecting the Ica stones directly to these traditions remains speculative without definitive archaeological linkage. The absence of excavation records continues to define the debate as much as the engravings themselves. Without stratigraphy, association, or controlled recovery, even the most detailed analysis remains partially suspended in uncertainty. And yet, despite all methodological caution, the stones persist in public imagination. They are studied, debated, and revisited not because they offer resolution, but because they resist it, inviting repeated attempts to impose structure on something that remains incomplete. Ultimately, as the light fades across the engraved surfaces, the stones return to stillness. They neither confirm nor deny the stories told about them. Instead, they remain exactly where they have always been, at the edge of understanding, where evidence ends and interpretation begins again. From the engraved surfaces of the Ica stones, where contested imagery continues to blur the boundary between cultural symbolism and modern interpretation, the narrative shifts once again across continents and climates. The dry heat of the Peruvian desert fades into cool northern air, into forested hills, granite outcrops, and glacially shaped lakes formed by ancient ice. The setting changes, but the sense of uncertainty remains. In the northeastern United States, within the region surrounding Lake Winnipesaukee, a small, smooth object was discovered in the late 19th century that would quietly become one of archaeology's enduring curiosities. This object is now known as the Winnipesaukee Mystery Stone. At first glance, it is unassuming. A hand-sized, egg-shaped stone, carefully polished with a dark, fine-grained surface. Its shape suggests deliberate selection rather than random geological formation. But what immediately distinguishes it is not its form. It is the network of engraved markings covering its surface. Lines intersect with precision. Dots are arranged in structured sequences. Curved motifs and linear divisions appear to divide the stone into sections, almost as if mapping space or recording information. Some areas resemble symbolic patterns. Others evoke what might be interpreted as narrative or calendrical structure. Unlike larger archaeological monuments, this object is intimate in scale. It fits comfortably in the hand, inviting close inspection. Yet the complexity of its surface contrasts sharply with its size, creating an immediate sense of intentional design. The stone was reportedly discovered during the 1870s in the vicinity of Lake Winnipesaukee, though its exact origin story is itself part of the uncertainty that surrounds it. According to historical accounts, it was unearthed during construction-related activities, but documentation from the period is limited, and the full archaeological context was never systematically recorded. This absence of context has shaped every subsequent interpretation. In mainstream archaeological assessment, the Winnipesaukee Mystery Stone is generally regarded as a product of relatively recent indigenous or post-contact activity, or potentially even a ceremonial object created in the historic period. However, due to the lack of controlled excavation data, definitive classification remains elusive. Without stratigraphic evidence, material association, or comparative artifacts from a secure context, the stone resists firm placement within established cultural timelines. And so interpretation relies primarily on the object itself. The engravings have been analyzed in detail, revealing a structured pattern that some researchers have described as potentially symbolic or decorative rather than strictly functional. The arrangement of dots and lines has led to comparisons with calendrical systems, tallying systems, or mnemonic devices used in various indigenous cultures across North America. However, no direct parallel has been definitively established. The geometric precision of the markings has also invited speculation beyond academic interpretation. Some observers have suggested that the stone may encode information in a symbolic system that is no longer understood. Others have proposed that it may represent a ceremonial object used in ritual contexts, where meaning was embedded not in literal reading, but in symbolic resonance. Such interpretations remain speculative, but they highlight an important aspect of archaeological inquiry: the challenge of interpreting symbolic systems without linguistic keys. In many ancient cultures, symbols were not designed to be read in the modern sense. Instead, they functioned as carriers of meaning within ritual, social, or cosmological frameworks. Without cultural continuity, such systems can become opaque, leaving behind objects whose purpose is visible, but whose meaning is not immediately recoverable. The stone's surface invites this kind of ambiguity. Certain patterns appear to repeat with intentional spacing. Others seem to divide the stone into segmented zones, as if marking different categories of information. Yet, without corroborating artifacts or contextual evidence, these observations remain open to interpretation. Material analysis of the stone itself suggests it is composed of a fine-grained, dense rock, likely sourced from glacial or riverine environments typical of the northeastern United States. The smoothing of its surface may be natural, resulting from water transport and abrasion over time. However, the regularity of its shape has led some to question whether it was selected or modified before engraving. The distinction between naturally shaped stones and intentionally prepared objects is often subtle in archaeological practice. Nature can produce remarkably symmetrical forms, especially through glacial movement. Human selection, however, often enhances or recontextualizes these forms, adding layers of meaning through modification. In this case, the line between natural and modified remains indistinct. The surrounding region of Lake Winnipesaukee has a long history of human presence, including indigenous groups who lived in the region for thousands of years prior to European contact. Archaeological evidence from the broader New England area shows a wide range of tool-making traditions, ceremonial practices, and symbolic expressions. However, the specific stylistic features of the Winnipesaukee stone do not align clearly with any single known tradition. This lack of alignment does not necessarily indicate anomaly. It may simply reflect the diversity of symbolic expression across time and cultures. Yet it does contribute to the object's enduring ambiguity. Over time, the stone has passed through private hands, museum displays, and scholarly discussion. Each stage of its journey has added layers of interpretation, documentation, and sometimes controversy. Early reports attempted to place it within indigenous cultural frameworks, while later analyses have approached it more cautiously, emphasizing the limitations of available evidence. As with many isolated artifacts, interpretation becomes increasingly shaped by the absence of context rather than the presence of certainty. And yet, the object continues to attract attention precisely because of what it suggests, rather than what it confirms. It is small enough to be overlooked, yet complex enough to resist dismissal. It does not belong to a larger known assemblage, yet it appears too deliberate to be purely accidental. It sits at the intersection of possibility and uncertainty, where meaning is suggested but not fully accessible. The Winnipesaukee Mystery Stone therefore occupies a unique position within archaeological discussion, not as a definitive answer, but as an unresolved question preserved in stone. In quiet museum displays and private collections, it is often viewed under controlled lighting, where its engravings cast faint shadows across its curved surface. In those moments, it becomes less an object of classification and more an object of contemplation. And so the question remains, echoing gently beneath the surface of interpretation. When an artifact carries structured markings but lacks a clear cultural or contextual anchor, are we observing a forgotten system of meaning, or only the limits of what time has allowed us to understand? Yet even beyond the scholarly debate, The stone continues to exist as a silent witness to its own unresolved story. It does not change, but the interpretations around it do, shifting with each generation that encounters it. In this way, it becomes less a fixed object and more a moving idea, shaped by the minds that study it. In archaeology, such objects often occupy a fragile space between certainty and speculation. Without context, every mark becomes both evidence and uncertainty at the same time. The Winnipesaukee stone stands precisely in that tension, where meaning is suggested but never fully secured. Some researchers have noted that similar symbolic ambiguity appears in other prehistoric traditions, where geometric patterns may carry layered meanings that are no longer easily translated. Could this stone be part of such a tradition, now fragmented beyond recognition, or something entirely separate? The question of intention remains central. Were the engravings meant to communicate information, record memory, or serve a ritual purpose that no longer survives in cultural transmission? Or are they the result of multiple hands, each adding to a surface over time without a single unified purpose? Time itself becomes a factor in interpretation. The longer an object remains without context, the more it absorbs meaning from those who study it. In this sense, the stone does not only preserve markings, it also preserves centuries of shifting human curiosity. Even the physicality of the object invites reflection. Its smooth contours and balanced form suggest careful selection, yet natural processes in glacial landscapes can produce similar shapes. The boundary between natural formation and human modification remains delicate and difficult to define with certainty. There is also the possibility that meaning was never intended to be preserved in a fixed or permanent way. Some symbolic systems are designed to be fluid, existing only within ritual practice or oral tradition. If that were the case here, the stone would be a fragment of a language no longer spoken. Museums and private collections that hold such objects often present them as artifacts of curiosity rather than resolved knowledge. Visitors encounter them not with answers, but with questions. Questions that tend to grow rather than diminish the longer one observes them. This transformation of uncertainty into fascination is part of what keeps the Winnipesaukee stone relevant in modern discussion. It does not resolve itself through time. Instead, it expands its interpretive space, allowing multiple narratives to coexist without resolution. And so, as attention slowly moves away from its engraved surface, the stone remains unchanged, quiet, polished, and unreadable in the deepest sense. The final question lingers not on what it is, but on what it might still become in the eyes of those who continue to study it.